Welcome, fellow wasteland wanderer, to a journey through time itself, a chronicle of humanity's final dance with destiny before the world was consumed by nuclear fire. Tonight, we're going to explore the complete timeline of the Great War, from the first whispers of resource scarcity in the early 21st century to those final, terrible moments on October 23rd, 2077, when civilization ended in a flash of atomic light. So settle in, make yourself comfortable, and let your mind drift back through the centuries to a time when the world still held hope for tomorrow. We'll walk through the gleaming corridors of Vault-Tec headquarters, stand in the command centers, where desperate generals made impossible choices, and witness the last desperate attempts to prevent the unpreventable. There's no need to remember every date or detail. Just let the story wash over you like the gentle glow of a Pip-Boy in the darkness, steady and reassuring as we traverse this tragic tale together. In the early decades of the 21st century, the world seemed poised on the brink of a technological renaissance that would carry humanity to heights undreamed of by previous generations. The year 2050 dawns with promise. Fusion power plants begin providing clean, unlimited energy to major cities, while robotic servants handle mundane tasks in homes across America. Children play with toy rockets while their parents plan vacations to the moon, confident that space colonization is merely a matter of time and investment. The atomic age, as historians would later call it, represents humanity's brief moment of absolute confidence in its technological destiny. Nuclear power, once feared for its destructive potential, has been harnessed to serve civilization's needs. The mushroom cloud that haunted the nightmares of previous generations has been replaced by the gentle glow of fusion reactors, their controlled reactions providing power for an increasingly energy-hungry world. American society in 2050 reflects this technological optimism. Suburban homes feature household robots that cook, clean, and tend gardens with mechanical precision. Television broadcasts beam directly into living rooms via satellite, while personal computers, though still room-sized, process information at speeds that stagger the imagination. The future seems not just bright, but inevitable, a steady progression toward technological perfection that will solve humanity's age-old problems of scarcity and conflict. The cultural zeitgeist embraces this atomic future with enthusiasm that borders on religious fervor. Popular music celebrates the space age, fashion incorporates atomic symbols and rocket motifs, and children's toys prepare them for life in a world of robots and ray guns. The Atomic Cafe serves fusion-powered coffee, while the Nuka-Cola Corporation markets its radioactive soft drinks as the taste of tomorrow. Even the architecture reflects this confidence, with buildings designed in sweeping curves that echo atomic structures and spacecraft. But beneath this gleaming surface, careful observers might notice troubling signs. The very technologies that promise abundance require resources on an unprecedented scale. Fusion reactors need rare materials. Robots require precision manufacturing. And the space program consumes budgets that dwarf previous government expenditures. The golden age of atomic power demands sacrifices that few are yet willing to acknowledge. The international community in 2050 still believes in cooperative solutions to global challenges. The United Nations, though often ineffective, provides a forum for nations to air grievances and seek peaceful resolutions. Trade flows freely between former enemies, and cultural exchange programs foster understanding between peoples. The spectre of nuclear war, while never entirely absent, seems manageable through treaties, diplomacy, and the mutual recognition that atomic weapons have made large-scale conflict too dangerous to contemplate. Scientists work across national boundaries on projects that benefit all humanity. The development of fusion power sees collaboration between American, European, and even Chinese researchers. Medical advances are shared freely, lifting life expectancy worldwide. Environmental challenges, while growing, seem solvable through the application of atomic-age technology. The world appears to be entering an era where international cooperation and technological progress will finally banish the old scourges of war, disease, and want. Yet even in this golden moment, the seeds of future conflict are being planted. Competition for the rare materials needed to sustain the atomic age creates tensions between have and have-not nations. The promise of unlimited clean energy proves more elusive than initially hoped, as fusion reactions prove difficult to maintain and control. Most ominously, the same technologies that power homes and heal the sick can be turned to military purposes with terrifying efficiency. By 2055, the first cracks begin to appear in the foundation of the atomic age's prosperity. Geologists and economists publish reports that send quiet ripples of concern through government halls and corporate boardrooms. The rare earth elements essential for advanced technology, the uranium for fusion reactors, the precious metals for computer circuits, the exotic alloys for spacecraft, are not as abundant as the optimistic projections of the previous decade suggested. The oil reserves that powered the Industrial Revolution show signs of depletion that can no longer be ignored. While fusion power promises to eventually replace petroleum-based energy, the transition proves slower and more expensive than anyone anticipated. More problematically, petroleum serves as the foundation for countless products beyond fuel. Plastics, chemicals, medicines, and synthetic materials that have become essential to modern life. Finding substitutes for these petroleum-derived products challenges even the most advanced atomic-age chemistry. Water, that most basic of human needs, begins to show scarcity in regions where population growth and industrial development have outpaced natural replenishment. The great aquifers that sustained agricultural expansion for centuries drop to alarming levels. Rivers run lower, lakes shrink, and the snows that feed them fall less frequently. Climate scientists, still a small and often dismissed community, begin to voice concerns about human influence on weather patterns. Agricultural production, despite advances in atomic-age farming techniques, struggles to keep pace with global population growth. The Green Revolution's miracle crops require ever-increasing inputs of fertilizer, pesticides, and water to maintain their yields. Soil depletion becomes a problem in regions that have farmed intensively for decades. Food prices, stable for years, begin to show upward pressure that concerns economists and politicians alike. The military implications of resource scarcity become apparent to strategic planners, though such concerns remain classified and hidden from public view. Pentagon analysts quietly revise their assessments of global stability, noting that resource competition could provide flashpoints for future conflicts. Similar exercises in Moscow, Beijing, and other capitals reach comparable conclusions. The golden age of plenty may be ending sooner than anyone hoped. Corporate leaders, privy to geological surveys and market analyses unavailable to the general public, begin making strategic decisions that reflect their awareness of coming scarcity. Companies invest heavily in securing long-term access to critical materials, sometimes through partnerships, and sometimes through more questionable arrangements with cooperative governments. The free market, so celebrated in the atomic age's early years, shows signs of distortion as major players seek to control rather than compete for essential resources. International tensions, while still manageable through diplomatic channels, acquire new dimensions as nations begin to calculate their resource needs decades into the future. Trade agreements become more complex, incorporating not just immediate exchanges, but long-term guarantees of supply. Foreign aid programs increasingly focus on securing access to strategic materials rather than pure humanitarian concerns. The collaborative spirit of the early atomic age gradually gives way to more transactional relationships. Yet the public remains largely unaware of these developing concerns. Government officials and corporate leaders see no benefit in alarming citizens about problems that may never materialize or may be solved through technological innovation. The media, focused on the exciting developments in space exploration and consumer technology, pays little attention to dry reports about resource availability. Life continues much as before, with the underlying tensions building like pressure in a reactor core. As resource concerns mount throughout the late 2050s, European nations begin to recognize that their individual capabilities are insufficient to secure the materials and energy needed to maintain their atomic age lifestyles. The formation of the European Commonwealth in 2057 represents one of history's most ambitious attempts at international cooperation, bringing together former enemies in a desperate bid to pool resources and coordinate responses to global scarcity. The Commonwealth emerges from a series of emergency conferences held in neutral Switzerland, where diplomats and economists frankly discuss the resource projections that their governments prefer to keep classified. The numbers are sobering. Europe's domestic uranium reserves will support current fusion reactor operations for perhaps 2 decades. Its rare earth deposits are even more limited. Most critically, the continent depends entirely on imported petroleum for the chemical feedstocks that sustain its plastics and pharmaceutical industries. The initial Commonwealth Treaty focuses on resource sharing and joint procurement. Member nations agree to coordinate their purchases of strategic materials, preventing bidding wars that drive up prices. They establish joint stockpiles of critical supplies, maintained in secure facilities scattered across the continent. Research and development efforts are consolidated to eliminate duplication and maximize efficiency. The goal is clear: to create a resource base large enough to support European civilization through the coming century. But the Commonwealth's ambitions extend beyond mere resource management. European leaders envision their confederation as a prototype for global cooperation, a demonstration that nations can work together to solve the challenges of the atomic age. They invest heavily in alternative energy research, seeking to reduce dependence on imported uranium. They launch ambitious recycling programs to extract maximum value from existing materials. Most ambitiously, they begin planning for space-based resource extraction, imagining asteroid mines that could supply Europe's needs indefinitely. The European space program, coordinated through Commonwealth institutions, achieves remarkable early successes. European rockets place satellites in orbit with increasing frequency and reliability. Moon missions, while still experimental, begin providing valuable data about lunar resource potential. The asteroid surveys reveal tantalizing possibilities. Metallic asteroids containing more platinum and rare Earth elements than exist in Earth's accessible deposits. The future seems bright for European resource security. However, the Commonwealth's formation does not go unnoticed by the rest of the world. American officials express concern about European coordination affecting global markets. Chinese and Russian leaders worry about being excluded from resource agreements. Most significantly, Middle Eastern nations begin to question whether their petroleum exports are pricing them out of the atomic age's benefits. The Commonwealth's success in securing resources inevitably means less availability for others. Internal tensions within the Commonwealth also emerge as member nations struggle to balance national interests with collective needs. Wealthier nations contribute more to joint programs, but expect greater influence over decisions. Poorer members sometimes find their domestic needs subordinated to Commonwealth-wide priorities. Language barriers, cultural differences, and historical grievances complicate what should be purely technical discussions about resource allocation. The Commonwealth's relationship with its former colonies becomes particularly complex. European nations seek continued access to African and Asian resources, while those regions demand greater compensation and technology transfer. The old colonial relationships, supposedly ended decades earlier, reassert themselves in new forms as resource scarcity makes every deposit of strategic materials a potential source of conflict. Despite these challenges, the European Commonwealth represents humanity's best hope for managing resource scarcity through cooperation rather than conflict. Its research programs advance atomic age technology. Its conservation efforts demonstrate sustainable practices, and its diplomatic initiatives provide models for other regions. Yet even as it succeeds in its immediate goals, the Commonwealth's very success may be sowing the seeds of future conflict by creating a resource-rich bloc that others feel compelled to challenge. While Europe organizes its Commonwealth and America continues to consume resources at unprecedented rates, the Middle East finds itself in an increasingly precarious position as the atomic age advances. The region's vast petroleum reserves, which brought wealth and global influence throughout the 20th century, face challenges that threaten to fundamentally alter the balance of world power. The development of fusion power, while promising unlimited clean energy, paradoxically increases rather than decreases pressure on Middle Eastern oil supplies. Fusion reactors, despite their advanced technology, prove difficult to control and maintain. They require petroleum-derived lubricants, coolants, and specialized materials that cannot be synthesized through other means. More critically, the chemical industry's dependence on petroleum feedstocks means that even a fully atomic-powered world still needs oil for plastics, pharmaceuticals, and synthetic materials. Middle Eastern leaders, initially confident that their oil wealth provides permanent leverage in international affairs, begin to realize that their position is more vulnerable than they imagined. Geological surveys, conducted with atomic age precision, reveal that even the region's vast reserves are finite. Extraction costs increase as the easiest deposits are exhausted, forcing exploration into more challenging environments. The eternal flow of petroleum that seemed guaranteed to previous generations now appears to have an expiration date. The discovery of significant uranium deposits in several Middle Eastern nations provides new opportunities, but also new challenges. These radioactive ores require careful handling and processing that most regional governments lack the expertise to manage safely. International partners offer technology transfer and development assistance, but such arrangements inevitably involve foreign control over strategic resources. The choice between independence and expertise creates dilemmas that test traditional approaches to resource management. Regional conflicts, long suppressed by the overwhelming importance of maintaining oil production, begin to resurface as nations calculate their long-term strategic positions. Border disputes that seemed settled decades earlier acquire new significance when they involve potential uranium deposits. Water rights, already contentious in the arid region, become critical as atomic age industries require vast quantities for cooling and processing. Ethnic and religious tensions intertwine with resource competition in ways that make peaceful resolution increasingly difficult. The Arab oil embargo of 2059 provides a preview of how resource scarcity might destabilize international relations. When several Middle Eastern nations coordinate production cuts to pressure Western support for their uranium development programs, the resulting economic disruption ripples throughout the atomic age economy. Fusion reactor construction slows, plastic production stutters, and chemical shortages affect everything from medicine to agriculture. The embargo lasts only 3 months, but its effects linger in strategic planning offices around the world. American and European responses to Middle Eastern resource politics reveal the growing tensions between atomic age ideals and practical necessities. Public rhetoric emphasizes cooperation and mutual benefit, but classified documents show increasing concern about the reliability of resource supplies. Military planners begin updating contingency plans for securing critical facilities, while diplomats work frantically to maintain relationships with increasingly assertive regional governments. The development of synthetic fuel programs in consuming nations adds another layer of complexity to Middle Eastern calculations. If petroleum can be replaced by atomic-powered synthesis, the region's leverage diminishes significantly. But such technologies remain experimental and expensive, requiring resources and expertise that few nations possess. The race between developing alternatives and exhausting existing supplies creates uncertainty that affects every aspect of regional and global planning. Middle Eastern societies themselves struggle with the implications of their changing strategic position. Generations that grew up expecting perpetual oil wealth must adapt to the possibility of post-petroleum futures. Educational systems emphasize science and technology to prepare for atomic age industries. Cultural values that celebrated traditional ways of life compete with pressures for rapid modernization. The social transformations required to transition from petroleum-based to atomic age economies create internal tensions that affect political stability. The late 2050s witnessed dramatic shifts in Asian power relationships as resource scarcity and atomic age technologies reshape the region's strategic landscape. China, long focused on internal development and recovery from earlier conflicts, begins to assert itself as a major player in global resource competition. Japan, despite its painful history with atomic weapons, embraces civilian nuclear technology with characteristic efficiency and innovation. India and other emerging powers seek their own paths to atomic age prosperity, while navigating the complex currents of great power rivalry. China's entry into serious resource competition marks a fundamental shift in global dynamics. The nation's massive population and rapid industrialization create resource needs that dwarf those of traditional powers. Chinese leaders, studying the European Commonwealth's successes and America's consumption patterns, conclude that their nation's survival depends on securing reliable access to uranium, rare earth elements, and the petroleum feedstocks necessary for chemical industries. Their approach combines diplomatic outreach with strategic patience, building relationships that may prove crucial in future resource negotiations. The Chinese space program, launched with characteristic ambition and secrecy, focuses heavily on resource exploration and extraction. Chinese rockets achieve orbit with increasing reliability, while lunar missions provide valuable data about celestial mining possibilities. Unlike American and European programs that emphasize scientific research and national prestige, Chinese space efforts maintain clear commercial and strategic objectives. Their asteroid surveys identify potential targets for future exploitation, while lunar bases begin serving as platforms for deeper space exploration. Japanese technological innovation continues to amaze the world, but the island nation's resource constraints force creative solutions that other powers might not consider necessary. Japanese engineers develop the most efficient fusion reactors in the world, extracting maximum energy from minimal uranium inputs. Their recycling technologies recover valuable materials from waste streams with unprecedented efficiency. Most impressively, Japanese scientists pioneer the development of synthetic substitutes for scarce natural materials, creating atomic-age alternatives to traditional resources. The relationship between China and Japan, historically complicated by conflict and cultural differences, acquires new dimensions as both nations compete for similar resources while recognizing their mutual dependence on stable supply chains. Japanese technology and Chinese raw material access create potential synergies, but political tensions and strategic rivalries prevent the cooperation that might benefit both nations. Their competition spreads beyond Asia, affecting resource markets and diplomatic relationships worldwide. India's emergence as an atomic power creates additional complexity in Asian dynamics. The nation's nuclear weapons program, justified as necessary for defense against larger neighbors, diverts resources from civilian fusion development, while creating international concerns about proliferation. Indian leaders argue that their nation deserves the same access to atomic-age benefits enjoyed by earlier industrialized powers, but their weapons program complicates negotiations for uranium and technology transfers. The delicate balance between peaceful atomic development and military applications proves challenging for all nations to maintain. Southeast Asian nations find themselves courted by major powers, seeking access to their natural resources and strategic locations. Indonesian petroleum reserves become crucial for chemical feedstocks, as Middle Eastern supplies prove less reliable. Malaysian rare earth deposits attract intense international interest. The Philippines' strategic position makes it valuable for space program support facilities. These smaller nations must navigate carefully between great power pressures while seeking to maximize their own benefits from resource agreements. The formation of various Asian cooperation frameworks mirrors the European Commonwealth's approach, but reflects the region's greater diversity and more complex political relationships. ASEAN expands its scope to include resource coordination, while bilateral agreements between major powers create overlapping obligations and potential conflicts. The absence of a unifying threat like Europe's resource scarcity makes Asian cooperation more difficult to achieve and maintain. Religious and cultural factors add additional layers to Asian resource politics. Islamic nations coordinate through religious networks that transcend traditional diplomatic channels. Buddhist and Hindu traditions influence approaches to technological development and environmental protection. Confucian principles affect Chinese strategic thinking about long-term resource management. These cultural dimensions create both opportunities for cooperation and sources of potential conflict as nations pursue their atomic age ambitions. The growing militarization of resource competition becomes particularly visible in Asian waters, where territorial disputes over potentially resource-rich areas escalate in significance. The South China Sea, with its possible underwater uranium deposits, becomes a focus of competing claims. Disputes over fishing rights acquire new importance as atomic age industries create demand for marine resources. Naval buildups, justified as necessary for protecting commercial shipping, create tensions that could easily escalate into larger conflicts. The year 2066 marks the beginning of what historians would later call the Great Dying, a cascade of environmental and social collapses that set the stage for the resource wars and ultimately the Great War itself. It begins quietly, with scattered reports of crop failures and unexplained die-offs of wildlife. But these seemingly isolated incidents soon reveal themselves as symptoms of a much larger crisis threatening the foundations of human civilization. The new plague emerges first in the sprawling industrial cities of the American Midwest, where atomic age manufacturing has concentrated chemical production and waste processing. Workers in plastics factories begin reporting respiratory illnesses that resist conventional treatment. The symptoms are unlike anything in medical literature. Progressive lung deterioration, accompanied by neurological complications that suggest toxic exposure rather than biological infection. Medical authorities initially dismiss these cases as occupational hazards, but the pattern spreads too quickly and affects too many people to ignore. Environmental scientists, long marginalized by the atomic age's focus on technological solutions, begin documenting connections between industrial activities and ecological disruption. The chemical byproducts of atomic age manufacturing, dispersed through air and water systems, accumulate in ways that earlier environmental impact studies failed to predict. Soil samples from agricultural regions reveal contamination levels that threaten food safety. Water supplies in major cities require increasingly sophisticated treatment to remain potable. The promise of clean atomic energy proves complicated by the reality of dirty atomic age industry. The collapse of bee populations across North America provides a dramatic illustration of the interconnected nature of environmental systems. These vital pollinators, essential for agricultural production, succumb to a combination of chemical exposures and habitat destruction that atomic age development has accelerated. Crop yields begin declining just as global population reaches levels that require maximum agricultural efficiency. The mathematical inevitability of food shortages begins to dawn on agricultural economists and government planners. International responses to the emerging environmental crisis reveal the fault lines that will eventually fracture into open conflict. European Commonwealth nations, with their emphasis on coordination and planning, begin implementing strict environmental controls that slow their industrial production but preserve long-term sustainability. American leaders, under pressure from industries that drive economic growth, resist regulations that might compromise their competitive position. Chinese authorities, focused on rapid development to meet their population's needs, dismiss environmental concerns as luxuries they cannot afford. The psychological impact of environmental collapse proves as significant as its physical effects. The atomic age promised that technology would solve humanity's age-old problems, but the Great Dying suggests that technological solutions may create new problems faster than they solve old ones. Public confidence in scientific expertise begins to erode as experts admit uncertainty about the scope and solutions for environmental challenges. The optimism that characterized the early atomic age gives way to a more somber recognition of technology's limitations and dangers. Medical systems, designed for the health challenges of previous eras, struggle to cope with environmentally induced illnesses that resist traditional treatments. Hospitals overflow with patients suffering from conditions that medical schools never taught doctors to treat. Research into environmental medicine accelerates, but the complexity of chemical interactions and long-term exposure effects makes progress slow and uncertain. The promise of atomic age medicine, that technology would eliminate disease, confronts the reality that technology can also create new forms of suffering. Agricultural adaptation efforts show both human ingenuity and the magnitude of the challenge facing food production systems. Farmers experiment with crop varieties that can tolerate contaminated soils and polluted water. Hydroponic and indoor growing systems proliferate as traditional agriculture proves increasingly unreliable. But these alternatives require energy and resources on scales that strain atomic age infrastructure. The choice between feeding the population and maintaining environmental protection becomes increasingly stark. The economic implications of environmental collapse ripple through global markets in ways that complicate international relations. Insurance companies, facing unprecedented claims for environmental damage, raise premiums to levels that many businesses cannot afford. Agricultural commodity prices become volatile as crop failures create shortages followed by brief surpluses when alternative production methods succeed. Currency values fluctuate based on nations' perceived ability to manage environmental challenges rather than traditional economic indicators. Corporate responses to environmental crisis vary widely, creating market distortions that affect international competition. Companies that invest heavily in environmental protection find their costs increasing relative to competitors who continue polluting practices. This dynamic encourages a race to the bottom in environmental standards as businesses seek to maintain profitability. International trade agreements become complicated by disputes over environmental dumping and the true costs of atomic age production methods. The social movements that emerge in response to environmental collapse begin to challenge the fundamental assumptions of atomic age society. Environmental activists, previously dismissed as anti-progress extremists, gain credibility as their warnings prove prophetic. Religious leaders interpret the Great Dying as divine judgment on humanity's hubris in pursuing atomic power. Political movements advocating for radical changes in economic and social systems gain support from populations desperate for alternatives to the failing status quo. The environmental pressures of the Great Dying interact with existing resource scarcities to create the perfect conditions for international conflict. The resource wars, which begin in earnest in 2067, represent humanity's abandonment of cooperative solutions in favor of zero-sum competition for the materials necessary to sustain atomic age civilization. What starts as economic competition escalates through diplomatic pressure to proxy conflicts and finally to direct military confrontation between major powers. The European Commonwealth's attempt to secure exclusive access to African uranium deposits provides the spark that ignites wider conflict. Commonwealth negotiators, backed by superior technology and financial resources, sign agreements with several African governments that effectively exclude other powers from accessing these critical resources. American and Chinese representatives, arriving to find their access blocked by European contracts, respond with increasingly aggressive counteroffers that destabilize regional politics. The Congo crisis of 2068 demonstrates how quickly resource competition can escalate into military intervention. When the Congolese government attempts to renegotiate its uranium agreements to allow access for non-European buyers, Commonwealth military advisors encourage a military coup that installs a more cooperative regime. American special forces, ostensibly providing counter-terrorism assistance, support rebel groups seeking to overthrow the new government. Chinese military engineers building infrastructure projects find themselves protecting their investments against attacks from all sides. Similar patterns emerge across the globe as major powers abandon diplomatic niceties in favor of securing essential resources. The Middle East becomes a chessboard where American, European, and Chinese influence compete through proxy governments and military aid packages. Southeast Asian nations find themselves pressured to choose sides in resource allocation disputes that threaten their traditional neutrality. Even seemingly stable regions like South America experience destabilization as great powers seek to secure alternative supplies of strategic materials. The naval dimensions of resource competition prove particularly dangerous as nations deploy military forces to protect commercial shipping and resource extraction operations. The American Sixth Fleet increases its Mediterranean presence to protect Commonwealth uranium shipments from North Africa, while Chinese naval forces begin patrolling South China Sea routes that carry rare earth minerals to their industrial centers. Incidents at sea multiply as military vessels from different nations encounter each other in increasingly tense circumstances. The breakdown of international law becomes apparent as nations prioritize resource security over treaty obligations. The United Nations, already weakened by great power competition, proves incapable of mediating resource disputes when member nations consider their survival at stake. International courts issue rulings that major powers simply ignore when they conflict with resource security needs. The cooperative international system that emerged after World War II crumbles as nations return to unilateral action and power politics. Technological competition accelerates as nations seek military advantages that might offset resource disadvantages. European Commonwealth forces deploy advanced laser weapons powered by their efficient fusion reactors. American military units test prototype power armor that makes individual soldiers nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons. Chinese forces experiment with electromagnetic pulse weapons that can disable enemy electronics without destroying valuable infrastructure. The arms race that emerges from resource competition pushes military technology to new heights, while consuming resources that might otherwise address underlying scarcities. The human cost of the resource wars begins to mount as conflicts spread and intensify. Proxy wars in Africa and Southeast Asia create refugee crises that overwhelm regional capabilities. Military interventions disrupt resource extraction and agricultural production, worsening the very scarcities that motivated the conflicts. Civilian populations, caught between competing forces, suffer casualties and displacement that create lasting grievances and cycles of revenge. Economic warfare accompanies military conflict as nations weaponize trade relationships and financial systems. Export controls on strategic materials become instruments of statecraft, while currency manipulations seek to disadvantage competitors' resource purchases. Corporate assets are frozen or seized when their home governments take positions deemed hostile. The global economic integration that characterized the early atomic age fragments into competing economic blocs that mirror military alliances. Intelligence operations intensify as nations seek to gain advantages through espionage and sabotage. Industrial facilities in rival nations experience mysterious accidents that disrupt production of strategic materials. Computer systems controlling resource extraction operations suffer cyber attacks that seem too sophisticated for terrorist groups. Scientists working on alternative resource technologies disappear or defect under circumstances that suggest state involvement. The shadow war of intelligence services parallels and sometimes exceeds the violence of overt military conflict. The propaganda dimensions of resource conflict shape public opinion in ways that make peaceful resolution increasingly difficult. Government media outlets in all nations emphasize the existential nature of resource competition, portraying conflicts as matters of national survival rather than policy choices. enemy nations are depicted as aggressors, seeking to deny others the resources necessary for survival. These narrative frameworks create public expectations that make compromise appear as surrender and escalation as the only viable response to challenges. The dissolution of the United Nations in 2069 represents one of history's most significant failures of international cooperation, marking the end of humanity's most ambitious attempt to manage global conflicts through multilateral institutions. The organization's collapse removes the last significant barrier to unrestrained international competition and sets the stage for the increasingly desperate conflicts that will culminate in the Great War. The UN's paralysis becomes apparent during the Sahara uranium crisis, when 3 Commonwealth member nations, 2 American client states, and Chinese-backed rebel groups all claim legitimate authority over the same deposits. The Security Council, designed to mediate such disputes, finds itself unable to act as each major power exercises its veto to prevent any resolution that doesn't favor its position. Multiple sessions end in walkouts and accusations of bad faith, while the crisis on the ground escalates beyond diplomatic resolution. Secretary-General Maria Santos's desperate attempt to convene an emergency session outside the normal Security Council framework represents the organization's last hope for relevance. Her proposal for a resource-sharing agreement that would guarantee all nations access to strategic materials while preventing military competition initially attracts support from smaller nations. But the major powers, each convinced that exclusive access to resources is essential for national survival, refuse to consider any arrangement that limits their freedom of action. The American withdrawal from UN membership in March of 2069, announced in a terse statement citing the organization's inability to address threats to American resource security, triggers a cascade of departures that dooms the institution. European Commonwealth representatives argue that their collective membership provides greater influence than individual nation participation. But they too find themselves bound by UN procedures that prevent decisive action when speed is essential for resource acquisition. The Chinese decision to establish alternative international frameworks, beginning with the Shanghai Resource Cooperation Organization, demonstrates how quickly the international system fragments once major powers abandon multilateral constraints. The Shanghai Framework explicitly rejects Western-dominated institutions in favor of arrangements that prioritize resource sharing among participating nations. Similar regional organizations emerge as nations seek security through smaller, more manageable alliances rather than universal institutions. The final UN General Assembly session in September 2069 takes place in a nearly empty hall, with most major nations having withdrawn their delegations months earlier. Secretary-General Santos's farewell address, delivered to representatives of fewer than 30 nations, warns that the dissolution of international law will inevitably lead to global conflict. Her words prove prophetic, but by then, the momentum toward confrontation has become unstoppable. The practical consequences of UN dissolution appear almost immediately in the form of accelerated military buildups and abandoned arms control agreements. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty becomes meaningless when the organization responsible for monitoring compliance ceases to exist. Nuclear weapons programs, previously constrained by international oversight, accelerate as nations seek ultimate security through atomic arsenals. The careful architecture of arms control that prevented nuclear war for decades crumbles along with the institution that supported it. International law, dependent on UN institutions for interpretation and enforcement, reverts to the law of the jungle as nations apply whatever standards serve their immediate interests. Maritime boundaries become subjects for military enforcement rather than negotiated agreement. Territorial disputes that were frozen by international pressure thaw into active conflicts. The rules-based international order that emerged from World War II's devastation disappears, replaced by the balance of power politics that characterized earlier, more violent eras. The humanitarian implications of UN dissolution become apparent as refugee crises and natural disasters lose their international coordinator. The World Health Organization's warning systems for disease outbreaks cease functioning, just as environmental degradation creates conditions for new epidemics. Food aid programs end as contributing nations redirect resources to military preparations. The safety net that protected vulnerable populations from the worst effects of international competition disappears, leaving millions exposed to forces beyond their control. Regional organizations attempt to fill the vacuum left by UN dissolution, but their limited membership and resources prove inadequate for global challenges. The European Commonwealth's humanitarian programs cannot address crises outside Europe. The Arab League lacks the resources to manage refugee flows from African conflicts. Latin American cooperation frameworks focus on regional trade rather than global security. These partial solutions, while better than nothing, cannot replace the comprehensive approach that the UN theoretically provided. The collapse of international scientific cooperation represents another tragic consequence of UN dissolution. Research programs that shared data across national boundaries cease operating as nations classify information that might provide strategic advantages. Climate monitoring systems fragment into national programs that cannot provide comprehensive global coverage. Medical research into environmental diseases slows as scientists lose access to international databases and collaborative networks. The global problems that require international cooperation become more difficult to address just as they become more urgent. Corporate responses to the elimination of international regulatory frameworks create additional instability as businesses adapt to a world without universal standards. Multinational corporations fragment into national subsidiaries that must navigate conflicting legal systems and regulatory requirements. Supply chains that spanned continents become vulnerable to diplomatic disputes and military conflicts. The global economy that sustained atomic age prosperity begins to separate into regional blocs that mirror political and military alliances. The psychological impact of UN dissolution on global public opinion cannot be underestimated. The organization, despite its flaws, represented humanity's commitment to resolving conflicts through discussion rather than violence. Its disappearance signals to populations worldwide that their leaders have abandoned peaceful solutions in favor of preparing for war. This shift in expectations makes military spending more acceptable and diplomatic compromise more difficult, creating political pressures that push all nations toward confrontation. With the collapse of international oversight institutions, the pace of nuclear weapons development accelerates dramatically across the globe. Nations that previously relied on alliance relationships for security begin developing independent nuclear capabilities, while existing nuclear powers expand their arsenals far beyond any conceivable defensive need. The careful balance of terror that prevented nuclear war during the Cold War gives way to a multipolar nuclear competition that proves far more dangerous and unstable. The Israeli nuclear program, long suspected but never officially acknowledged, becomes overt as Middle Eastern resource conflicts threaten the nation's survival. Israeli leaders argue that their country's small size and surrounded position make nuclear weapons essential for deterring attacks by resource-hungry neighbors. The revelation of Israeli nuclear capabilities triggers immediate responses from Arab neighbors, who begin their own weapons programs, with assistance from major powers seeking regional influence. India's expansion from a minimal nuclear deterrent to a full-scale arsenal reflects similar calculations about national survival in an increasingly competitive world. The Indian weapons program, justified as necessary for deterring both Chinese and Pakistani threats, consumes resources that might otherwise address the nation's massive development needs. But Indian leaders conclude that national independence requires the ultimate deterrent, regardless of the economic costs involved. Japan's decision to develop nuclear weapons represents perhaps the most psychologically significant proliferation event of the period. The only nation to suffer atomic attack during World War II abandoned its pacifist constitution as resource competition threatened its survival. Japanese public opinion, long opposed to nuclear weapons, shifts dramatically when faced with the possibility of Chinese or American resource embargoes. The Japanese weapons program, characterized by typical efficiency and innovation, produces sophisticated nuclear devices that rival those of established powers. The emergence of non-state nuclear capabilities represents a new dimension of proliferation that existing control mechanisms were never designed to address. Multinational corporations with access to nuclear materials and expertise begin developing private security capabilities that include nuclear weapons. Their justification, protecting valuable resource extraction operations from state and non-state threats, creates a precedent that fundamentally changes the nature of nuclear deterrence. African uranium-producing nations, recognizing that their resources make them targets for great power intervention, begin developing nuclear weapons as the ultimate guarantee of sovereignty. The technical challenges of weapons development prove manageable when international suppliers, desperate for uranium access, provide equipment and expertise in exchange for long-term supply agreements. What emerges is a nuclear marketplace where technology transfers serve commercial rather than strategic purposes. The development of tactical nuclear weapons designed for battlefield use represents a particularly dangerous evolution in nuclear thinking. Military planners, faced with conventional conflicts over resource-rich territories, begin to consider nuclear weapons as tools for achieving limited objectives rather than ultimate deterrence. These smaller, more usable nuclear devices lower the threshold for nuclear conflict, while increasing the probability that nuclear weapons will actually be employed in combat. European Commonwealth nuclear coordination demonstrates both the benefits and dangers of collective nuclear programs. The shared European nuclear deterrent provides security for member nations while reducing individual weapons development costs. But command and control arrangements for collective nuclear weapons prove complex and potentially unstable when member nations have different threat perceptions and strategic priorities. The possibility that nuclear decisions might be made by committee rather than individual national leaders introduces new uncertainties into strategic calculations. Chinese nuclear expansion, driven by concerns about encirclement by hostile powers, produces an arsenal that rivals American and Russian capabilities within a remarkably short time. The Chinese program emphasizes survivability and penetration capabilities, designed to overcome enemy defenses. But the rapid expansion strains Chinese resources and creates internal debates about whether nuclear security is worth the economic costs involved. The modification of civilian nuclear facilities for weapons production becomes common as nations seek to develop nuclear capabilities while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. Fusion power plants, with their uranium fuel cycles and advanced technology, can be converted to weapons production more easily than earlier reactor designs. The dual-use nature of atomic-age technology makes non-proliferation efforts nearly impossible when nations are determined to acquire nuclear capabilities. The emergence of new delivery systems designed specifically for nuclear weapons creates additional instability in strategic relationships. Submarine-launched ballistic missiles proliferate as nations seek survivable nuclear forces. Hypersonic delivery vehicles threaten to compress decision-making time below the threshold necessary for rational crisis management. Space-based nuclear weapons, while prohibited by earlier treaties, become reality as nations seek to prevent their adversaries from achieving decisive advantages. The breakdown of nuclear safety protocols during rapid proliferation creates risks that extend beyond intentional nuclear warfare. Nuclear materials and weapons produced quickly and under wartime conditions lack the safety features that characterized earlier, more careful nuclear programs. Transportation and storage of nuclear materials become more dangerous as security measures cannot keep pace with production rates. The possibility of nuclear accidents that could trigger intentional nuclear conflict adds another layer of instability to an already dangerous situation. As the resource wars rage and nuclear proliferation accelerates, the environmental foundations of human civilization continue their accelerating collapse. The Great Dying, which began as isolated incidents of pollution and ecosystem disruption, evolves into a global environmental catastrophe that makes resource scarcity even more acute and international cooperation more difficult to achieve. The collapse of ocean ecosystems provides the most visible evidence of environmental crisis reaching critical thresholds. Fish populations, already stressed by overharvesting and pollution, crash as acidification from industrial emissions alters ocean chemistry. The marine food webs that sustained coastal populations for millennia disintegrate as species after species disappears from waters that once teemed with life. Coastal communities, dependent on fishing for both food and economic survival, face starvation and displacement that create new refugee crises. Agricultural systems, engineered for maximum production during the atomic age's optimistic years, prove unable to adapt to rapidly changing environmental conditions. Soil depletion reaches critical levels in major food-producing regions, while chemical contamination makes previously fertile areas unsuitable for food production. Climate disruption, accelerated by industrial emissions, creates weather patterns that confound agricultural planning and destroy crops with increasing frequency. The atmospheric consequences of accelerated industrial production become impossible to ignore, as air quality in major cities deteriorates to levels that threaten human health. The chemical byproducts of atomic age manufacturing, dispersed globally through atmospheric circulation, create pollution problems that cross national boundaries and complicate international relations. Acid rain damages forests and agricultural areas far from the industrial sources that produce it, creating diplomatic disputes over environmental responsibility. Water systems, essential for both human survival and industrial production, face contamination that overwhelms natural purification processes and technological treatment capabilities. Rivers that served as transportation routes and waste disposal systems for centuries become too toxic to support either function. Groundwater aquifers, accumulated over geological timescales, become contaminated with industrial chemicals that will persist for centuries. The competition for clean water becomes as intense as the struggle for other strategic resources. The psychological impact of environmental collapse on human populations creates social instability that complicates efforts to address underlying problems. Communities that lose their natural environment experience forms of trauma that affect everything from mental health to social cohesion. Traditional cultures that define themselves through relationships with natural environments face identity crises when those environments disappear. The social disruption that results from environmental collapse makes coordinated responses more difficult, just when coordination becomes most essential. Corporate responses to environmental collapse reveal the tension between short-term profit and long-term survival that characterizes much of atomic age civilization. Companies facing immediate competitive pressures often cannot afford the investments necessary for environmental protection, even when their long-term survival depends on environmental stability. The market mechanisms that worked effectively for allocating resources during periods of abundance prove inadequate for managing the commons during periods of scarcity and decline. Technological attempts to address environmental problems often create new problems that are not apparent until damage is already done. Geoengineering projects designed to reverse climate change sometimes disrupt weather patterns in ways that cause more harm than the original problems they were meant to solve. Chemical treatments for pollution sometimes create new forms of contamination that are more dangerous than the substances they were designed to neutralize. The complexity of environmental systems makes unintended consequences almost inevitable when technological interventions are attempted at large scales. The migration patterns that emerge from environmental collapse create political pressures that destabilize regions far from the original sources of environmental damage. Populations fleeing environmental disasters become environmental refugees who compete with existing populations for increasingly scarce resources. These population movements, occurring on scales that dwarf historical precedents, create cultural conflicts and political tensions that make international cooperation more difficult. Medical systems face challenges from environmentally induced diseases that their training and resources were never designed to address. New forms of cancer, respiratory disease, and neurological disorders emerge from exposure to industrial chemicals and environmental toxins. The medical research necessary to understand and treat these conditions requires international cooperation that becomes increasingly difficult as nations focus on military competition rather than collaborative problem-solving. The extinction of species accelerates as environmental destruction eliminates habitats faster than ecosystems can adapt. The loss of biodiversity eliminates natural resources that might have provided solutions to human problems, while disrupting ecological relationships that maintained environmental stability. The biological foundation of human civilization disappears just as human communities face their greatest challenges in recorded history. Educational systems struggle to prepare new generations for living in a degraded environment while maintaining hope for environmental recovery. Children growing up during the environmental collapse develop different relationships with nature than previous generations, often characterized by fear and alienation, rather than appreciation and stewardship. These psychological changes affect how societies approach environmental problems and whether they can sustain the long-term commitments necessary for environmental restoration. The year 2076 opens with the two remaining superpowers, America and China, locked in a confrontation that has moved far beyond resource competition into existential struggle. The collapse of smaller powers under environmental and economic pressures has concentrated global attention on this final contest between different visions of how human civilization might survive the mounting crises of the atomic age. The American position, articulated by President Richardson in his State of the Union address, frames the confrontation in terms of defending democratic values and free market capitalism against authoritarian attempts to control global resources. But behind the ideological rhetoric lies a desperate calculation. America's atomic age lifestyle requires resources on a scale that China's rising consumption threatens to make impossible. The mathematics of resource scarcity have created a zero-sum game where Chinese prosperity means American decline. Chinese leaders present their own narrative of the confrontation, emphasizing their nation's historical right to development and their need to lift their massive population out of poverty. Premier Li's speeches to the National People's Congress describe American attempts to maintain exclusive access to global resources as imperialist aggression, designed to keep the majority of humanity in subordinate positions. The Chinese position resonates with many developing nations that see the American-Chinese conflict as determining whether their own development will be possible. The flashpoint that transforms cold confrontation into active preparation for war occurs in the South China Sea, where Chinese naval forces begin enforcing exclusive access to underwater rare earth deposits that international law technically classifies as belonging to multiple nations. The American Seventh Fleet's attempt to maintain freedom of navigation through these disputed waters leads to a series of incidents that bring both nations to the brink of armed conflict. The naval confrontation near the Spratly Islands in March of 2076 provides a preview of the destructive potential that modern weapons technology brings to great power conflict. Chinese electromagnetic pulse weapons disable the electronics on several American vessels without causing direct casualties, while American laser defense systems destroy Chinese missiles in flight. Both sides demonstrate capabilities that make traditional naval warfare obsolete, while revealing the vulnerability of complex technological systems to new forms of attack. The militarization of space represents perhaps the most dangerous dimension of Sino-American confrontation. Both nations have developed satellite networks that support their resource extraction operations, communications systems, and military command structures. The possibility that conflict might extend to attacks on space-based assets creates risks of cascading failures that could cripple technological civilization even without nuclear warfare. The debris fields that would result from space warfare could make orbital operations impossible for generations. Intelligence operations between the two superpowers intensify to levels that rival the most paranoid periods of the Cold War. American agents work to disrupt Chinese resource acquisition networks, while Chinese operatives seek to sabotage American industrial facilities. The shadow war of espionage and sabotage creates an atmosphere of suspicion and retaliation that makes peaceful resolution of disputes increasingly difficult. Each side attributes accidents and failures to enemy action, creating justifications for escalatory responses. The alliance systems that emerge around the American-Chinese confrontation force smaller nations to choose sides in a conflict that will determine their own futures. European Commonwealth nations, despite their own resource needs, generally align with America due to cultural affinities and existing trade relationships. African nations split between those dependent on Chinese development assistance and those aligned with Western resource companies. The polarization of the international system eliminates neutral ground and creates pressures for total commitment to one side or the other. Economic warfare accompanies military preparation as both superpowers attempt to weaken their opponent without triggering direct conflict. Trade embargoes, currency manipulations, and financial sanctions create economic disruption that affects civilian populations more than military capabilities. The global economy, already strained by resource scarcity and environmental collapse, fragments further as nations choose between American and Chinese economic systems. The technological dimensions of Sino-American competition drive innovation in military capabilities, while consuming resources that might otherwise address underlying problems. American development of advanced power armor gives individual soldiers unprecedented protection and firepower, while Chinese innovations in electronic warfare threaten to neutralize technological advantages through system disruption. The arms race between the superpowers pushes military technology to new heights, while making actual conflict more destructive if it occurs. The propaganda war between America and China shapes global public opinion in ways that make compromise more difficult for political leaders to achieve. American media emphasizes Chinese authoritarianism and resource hoarding, while Chinese media highlights American imperialism and environmental destruction. These competing narratives create public expectations that make any accommodation appear as betrayal of fundamental principles. The information war creates psychological conditions that make actual war more likely. The Chinese invasion of Alaska in 2076 represents the transition from cold confrontation to active warfare between the world's remaining superpowers. Alaska, with its vast oil reserves, strategic location, and sparse population, becomes the testing ground where both nations commit their most advanced military technologies and tactics in a conflict that previews the horror that global war would bring. The Chinese justification for the Alaskan operation rests on claims that American resource hoarding threatens Chinese national survival. Premier Li's address to the Chinese people describes the invasion as a defensive action designed to secure resources that rightfully belong to all humanity. The Chinese position resonates with many international observers who see American consumption patterns as unsustainable and unjust. But it cannot disguise the reality that the invasion represents an act of aggressive war. The initial Chinese assault demonstrates the effectiveness of their integrated military approach, combining conventional forces with advanced technologies in ways that overwhelm American defensive preparations. Chinese stealth transports, invisible to radar and thermal detection, land forces at multiple points along the Alaskan coast. Their electromagnetic pulse weapons disable American communications and sensor networks, creating confusion that allows Chinese forces to establish beachheads before effective resistance can be organized. American responses to the invasion reveal both the strengths and weaknesses of their technological approach to warfare. The deployment of T-51B power armor allows individual American soldiers to fight effectively against larger Chinese formations. But the complexity of power armor systems makes them vulnerable to the electronic warfare capabilities that Chinese forces employ. American laser weapons prove devastatingly effective when they function properly. But their power requirements and maintenance needs create logistical challenges in the harsh Alaskan environment. The battle for Anchorage becomes the symbol of American resistance to Chinese aggression, and the focus of global attention during the closing months of 2076. The city's strategic importance as a transportation hub and resource processing center makes it the key to controlling Alaskan resources. Both sides commit their best units and most advanced equipment to a battle that becomes a technological proving ground for weapons systems that will later be deployed globally. The civilian population of Alaska finds itself caught between two armies equipped with weapons that can level buildings and create contaminated zones lasting for decades. Refugee columns fleeing the combat zones face attacks from both sides, as military commanders prioritize tactical objectives over civilian safety. The Alaskan conflict provides a preview of how future warfare will affect non-combatant populations when advanced weapons systems are employed without restraint. The environmental consequences of the Alaskan War demonstrate how modern warfare can compound the ecological crisis that already threatens human civilization. Chemical weapons create toxic zones that will remain dangerous for generations. Energy weapons leave radioactive residues that contaminate soil and water supplies. The destruction of industrial facilities releases pollutants into the environment on scales that dwarf peacetime accidents. The cure for resource scarcity proves worse than the disease. International reactions to the Alaskan conflict reveal the extent to which the global community has fragmented into opposing camps. European Commonwealth nations provide material support to American forces while maintaining that they are not directly involved in the conflict. African nations aligned with China offer token support, while hoping to avoid being drawn into superpower warfare. The inability of any international institution to mediate the conflict demonstrates the complete collapse of global governance. The technological innovations that emerge from Alaskan combat experience influence military planning for the larger conflict that both sides recognize as inevitable. Chinese forces develop countermeasures for American power armor, while American engineers improve their systems based on battlefield feedback. Both sides study their opponent's capabilities and develop new weapons systems designed to exploit discovered weaknesses. The Alaskan conflict becomes a laboratory for perfecting the tools of global destruction. The media coverage of the Alaskan War shapes public opinion in ways that make escalation more likely and compromise less acceptable. American media emphasizes Chinese brutality and the heroism of American defenders, while Chinese media highlights American environmental destruction and resource waste. The competing narratives create public expectations that make any settlement short of total victory appear as defeat. The information war makes actual war harder to end once it begins. The psychological impact of the Alaskan conflict on both nations' populations creates pressures for escalation that political leaders find difficult to resist. American public opinion demands retaliation for the invasion, while Chinese citizens expect their government to achieve decisive victory to justify the costs of warfare. The democratic constraints that might normally limit warfare instead create pressures for leaders to demonstrate strength through military action. The logic of popular government leads toward total war. The strategic lessons that military planners draw from the Alaskan conflict influence preparations for global warfare in ways that make such conflict more destructive when it occurs. Both sides recognize that future battles will be decided by technological superiority rather than numerical advantages, leading to investments in weapons systems designed for maximum destructive effect. The professional military's assessment that warfare between advanced powers will be brief but devastating proves tragically accurate. The American annexation of Canada in 2076 represents one of the most significant territorial changes in North American history and demonstrates how resource scarcity can override political traditions and legal arrangements that seemed permanent. The integration of Canadian resources into the American war economy proves essential for sustaining the conflict with China. But the methods employed reveal the extent to which democratic nations abandon their principles when survival appears at stake. The legal justification for annexation rests on provisions of the North American Free Trade Agreement that allow for emergency resource sharing during national security crises. American lawyers argue that the Chinese invasion of Alaska constitutes an attack on North American security that triggers mutual defense obligations requiring Canadian cooperation. The legal arguments convince few international observers, but they provide domestic political cover for actions that most Americans recognize as necessary, regardless of their technical legality. Canadian resistance to annexation proves limited and ineffective, despite the obvious violation of sovereignty involved. The Canadian military, designed for peacekeeping and domestic security rather than defending against superpower aggression, cannot meaningfully oppose American forces that include power-armored infantry and advanced weapons systems. More significantly, many Canadians recognize that their nation's survival depends on American protection against Chinese expansion, making resistance self-defeating. The integration of Canadian resources into American war production demonstrates the efficiency that can be achieved when legal and bureaucratic obstacles are eliminated by emergency conditions. Canadian uranium mines increase production dramatically when freed from environmental regulations and labor restrictions. Oil sands operations expand rapidly when strategic necessity overrides cost considerations. The massive resource base that results from annexation provides America with the material foundation necessary for sustained warfare against China. The treatment of Canadian civilians during the annexation process reveals both American pragmatism and the moral compromises that total war requires. Canadian government officials who cooperate with integration receive favorable treatment and opportunities for advancement in the expanded American system. Those who resist find themselves marginalized or imprisoned on national security grounds. The civilian population generally accepts annexation when the alternatives appear to be Chinese occupation or nuclear devastation. The cultural implications of annexation create long-term challenges for American national identity and social cohesion. The integration of millions of Canadians into American society requires accommodations that strain existing political and social systems. French-Canadian populations resist cultural assimilation more strongly than English speakers, creating linguistic and political tensions that complicate governance. The diversity that Canadian integration brings to American society becomes both a source of strength and potential division. The economic benefits of Canadian annexation extend beyond resource extraction to include industrial capacity and human capital that strengthen American war capabilities. Canadian manufacturing facilities, converted to military production, significantly increase American capacity for producing advanced weapons systems. Canadian scientists and engineers, integrated into American research programs, accelerate development of new military technologies. The human resources that annexation provides prove as valuable as natural resources. The international legal precedents established by Canadian annexation influence other nations' calculations about territorial expansion and resource acquisition. The demonstration that international law cannot protect even close allies when superpowers determine that strategic necessity requires action encourages other nations to pursue unilateral solutions to resource problems. The breakdown of territorial stability creates additional pressures for military conflict as nations seek to secure resources before their neighbors act. The administrative challenges of governing an expanded territory while fighting a global war strain American governmental systems beyond their designed capacity. The extension of American law and institutions to Canadian territory requires bureaucratic expansion at precisely the time when resources should be focused on military requirements. The complications of integrating different legal systems, currencies, and administrative procedures create inefficiencies that handicap the war effort the annexation was designed to support. The environmental consequences of accelerated resource extraction in annexed Canadian territory compound the ecological crisis that already threatens North American civilization. Mining operations expanded without environmental oversight create pollution problems that will persist long after the war ends. The short-term focus on resource extraction for military purposes ignores long-term sustainability considerations that might determine whether human civilization can survive in North America after the conflict concludes. The psychological impact of annexation on both American and Canadian populations creates social tensions that affect wartime morale and post-war planning. Americans must reconcile their democratic values with the reality of conquering their peaceful neighbor, while Canadians face the loss of national independence that defined their identity. The cultural integration required by annexation occurs under wartime pressures that make accommodation more difficult and resentment more likely. The strategic vulnerability that Canadian annexation creates for American defensive planning becomes apparent when Chinese forces begin targeting former Canadian territory with the same intensity as traditional American targets. The expansion of American territory increases the area that must be defended while creating new targets for enemy attack. The geographic expansion that was intended to strengthen America's strategic position instead creates additional vulnerabilities that Chinese planners are quick to exploit. As the Sino-American conflict intensifies, the European Commonwealth faces the agonizing decision of whether to remain neutral or actively support their American allies. The choice becomes more difficult as Chinese diplomatic pressure increases, and the possibility of global conflict makes neutrality increasingly untenable. European preparations for potential involvement in global warfare reveal both the advantages of coordinated planning and the internal tensions that threaten Commonwealth unity. The European debate over war involvement reflects deeper philosophical differences about the nature of international responsibility and the limits of national self-interest. French leaders argue that European involvement in an American-Chinese resource war serves no European interest and risks destroying European civilization for the benefit of others. German officials contend that Chinese victory would eventually threaten European access to global resources, making early involvement preferable to later isolation. British representatives emphasize cultural and historical ties with America, while acknowledging the risks that such associations create. The military preparations that accompany political debate demonstrate European technological capabilities and organizational efficiency. European laser weapon systems, more advanced than either American or Chinese equivalents, provide significant battlefield advantages when properly employed. European electronic warfare capabilities can disrupt enemy communications and sensor systems with precision that minimizes collateral damage. The integration of national military forces under Commonwealth command creates a unified force structure that maximizes European military potential. The resource calculations that drive European strategic planning reveal the extent to which the Commonwealth has achieved its goal of resource security through coordinated action. European stockpiles of strategic materials can sustain military operations for extended periods without requiring access to contested global supplies. European recycling and conservation programs have reduced dependence on resource imports while maintaining high standards of living. The foundation for independent action exists if European leaders choose to use it. The alliance negotiations between European and American representatives create tension between European desires for independence and American expectations of support. American negotiators assume that cultural affinities and shared democratic values automatically create alliance obligations during crisis. European diplomats insist that their nation's interests must be considered separately from their cultural sympathies. The resulting agreements reflect compromise that satisfies neither side completely, while creating obligations that may prove difficult to fulfill under wartime pressures. The internal European debate over Chinese diplomatic overtures reveals the appeal of Chinese proposals for resource-sharing arrangements that could keep Europe out of the global conflict. Chinese diplomats offer long-term contracts for rare earth elements and other strategic materials in exchange for European neutrality in the Sino-American conflict. The Chinese proposals appear generous, but European analysts worry about the long-term implications of dependence on Chinese resource supplies for European independence. The technological cooperation between European nations accelerates as military necessities override traditional national jealousies and competitive concerns. British nuclear technology combines with French missile systems and German manufacturing capabilities to create weapon systems that exceed what any single nation could produce independently. The integration of European military-industrial capabilities demonstrates the potential benefits of international cooperation, while highlighting the tragedy that such cooperation occurs only under the pressure of impending warfare. The civil defense preparations that European governments implement reveal both the seriousness with which they approach the possibility of global conflict and the limitations of protective measures against atomic-age weapons. Shelter construction programs provide protection against conventional attacks and radioactive fallout, but cannot defend against direct nuclear strikes or the economic disruption that global warfare would create. The preparations reassure civilian populations while acknowledging the reality that European civilization faces existential threats, regardless of the protective measures implemented. The diplomatic initiatives that European leaders pursue represent final attempts to prevent global conflict through negotiated settlement of resource disputes. European proposals for international resource-sharing agreements and arms limitation treaties receive polite attention from American and Chinese representatives, but the momentum toward conflict has progressed beyond the point where diplomatic solutions appear viable. The European mediation efforts serve primarily to establish historical records that European nations attempted to prevent the catastrophe they see approaching. The intelligence assessments that inform European decision-making paint increasingly pessimistic pictures of global stability and the likelihood of avoiding general warfare. European intelligence services, among the world's most sophisticated, conclude that both American and Chinese leaders have made commitments that make compromise impossible without unacceptable loss of face. The professional judgment of Europe's best analysts is that global conflict has become inevitable, making European involvement a matter of timing rather than choice. The economic preparations for potential warfare demonstrate European efficiency in converting civilian production to military purposes while maintaining essential services for civilian populations. European factories retool for military production with minimal disruption to overall economic activity. European agricultural systems increase production of essential foods while reducing luxury crops that consume resources without contributing to war capabilities. The economic mobilization occurs smoothly enough to suggest that European entry into global conflict would not create the domestic disruption that affects other powers. The psychological preparation of European populations for potential involvement in global warfare reveals both European sophistication in crisis management and the fundamental horror that the prospect of atomic-age conflict creates in civilian minds. Government information campaigns educate citizens about protective measures and emergency procedures, while avoiding panic-inducing details about weapons effects and casualty projections. The balance between preparation and reassurance becomes increasingly difficult to maintain as the probability of European involvement in global conflict increases. October 2077 opens with a world balanced on the precipice of total destruction. As the final diplomatic efforts to prevent global nuclear warfare compete with military preparations that assume such warfare has become inevitable. The month that will end with the Great War begins with desperate attempts by rational voices to preserve some remnant of human civilization in the face of momentum toward mutual annihilation that appears unstoppable. The American ultimatum delivered to Chinese leadership on October 1st demands complete Chinese withdrawal from Alaska and payment of reparations for damage caused by the invasion. The ultimatum gives China 72 hours to respond and implicitly threatens nuclear warfare if compliance is not forthcoming. Chinese leaders, recognizing that acceptance would mean political suicide and national humiliation, begin their own preparations for the nuclear option, while publicly denouncing American threats as imperialist aggression. The European Commonwealth's emergency session convenes in Geneva to address the deteriorating international situation and determine European responses to the approaching crisis. The debate reveals fundamental divisions within European leadership about whether involvement in Sino-American conflict serves European interests or threatens European survival. The final resolution authorizes European military support for American forces, while maintaining that such support does not constitute a declaration of war against China. The Chinese response to the American ultimatum, delivered through Swiss intermediaries on October 3rd, rejects American demands while proposing a counter-ultimatum requiring American recognition of Chinese resource rights and withdrawal of American forces from Asian waters. The Chinese position includes implicit threats of nuclear retaliation if American attacks continue, creating a situation where both superpowers have committed themselves to positions that cannot be maintained without military action. The United Nations Secretary-General's final appeal for peace, broadcast globally on October 5th, acknowledges the international organization's inability to prevent the approaching conflict, while pleading with world leaders to consider the consequences of nuclear warfare for human civilization. The appeal receives widespread public support, but has no discernible effect on government policies in any major power. The failure of international appeals demonstrates the complete breakdown of global governance systems. The evacuation of major cities begins quietly on October 8th, as government agencies and corporate leaders receive classified warnings about the possibility of nuclear attacks. The evacuation creates panic in civilian populations who recognize that their governments expect nuclear warfare, despite public assurances that diplomatic solutions remain possible. The contrast between public statements and private actions reveals the extent to which political leaders have lost control of events they set in motion. The breakdown of global communications systems, beginning with satellite networks and extending to undersea cables, reflects both technical sabotage and the general collapse of international cooperation. By October 10th, normal communication between major powers has become impossible, forcing reliance on emergency channels that carry only the most essential messages. The communication breakdown eliminates opportunities for last-minute diplomatic initiatives, while increasing the probability of accidents and misunderstandings. The final week of October sees military forces worldwide assume their highest states of readiness, as commanders prepare for orders that everyone expects but no one wants to give. Nuclear weapon systems that have remained dormant for decades undergo final checks and targeting updates. Military personnel who join their services expecting peaceful careers face the prospect of participating in humanity's final conflict. The professional military's recognition that duty requires preparations for civilizational suicide creates psychological pressures that affect decision-making at every level. The stock market collapse that begins on October 15th reflects investor recognition that global nuclear warfare will make financial investments meaningless. The economic panic that accompanies military preparations creates additional pressure on political leaders to resolve the crisis through action rather than continued preparation. The interaction between economic collapse and military mobilization creates momentum toward conflict that exceeds what either factor alone might produce. The religious and philosophical responses to the approaching crisis demonstrate humanity's struggle to find meaning in circumstances that seem to negate all traditional sources of hope and purpose. Religious leaders worldwide call for prayer and repentance, while acknowledging their inability to influence political decisions that may determine humanity's survival. Philosophers and intellectuals attempt to articulate principles that might guide human action in circumstances beyond historical precedent. The spiritual dimension of the crisis receives attention that its political dimensions have long since transcended. The scientific community's final warnings about the consequences of nuclear warfare receive widespread publicity but little political attention, as military and political considerations override technical expertise. Scientists who developed atomic weapons decades earlier issue statements acknowledging their responsibility for creating instruments of potential human extinction while pleading for their non-use. The moral anguish of scientific leaders who enabled the approaching catastrophe adds ethical dimensions to political and military calculations. The intelligence failures that characterize the final weeks of October reflect the breakdown of rational analysis under pressure of approaching catastrophe. Intelligence agencies worldwide report information that confirms their government's preconceptions while filtering out data that might suggest alternative approaches. The intelligence community's inability to provide accurate assessments of enemy intentions increases the probability of miscalculation, while reducing opportunities for peaceful resolution of the crisis. The final diplomatic contacts between major powers occur through back channels that bypass normal government procedures, as official diplomacy proves incapable of addressing the crisis. Business leaders, religious figures, and academic specialists attempt to maintain communication between nations whose governments have ceased meaningful contact. These unofficial initiatives, while well-intentioned, lack the authority necessary to affect government policies that have acquired momentum beyond civilian control. The Great War begins not with a dramatic declaration or formal ceremony, but with routine monitoring procedures, detecting anomalous signatures from Chinese missile facilities near the Sea of Okhotsk. NORAD tracking stations in Alaska, their operators exhausted from weeks of heightened alert status, initially classify the detections as routine maintenance activities. The electromagnetic signatures match patterns associated with missile testing rather than actual launches, but the timing, precisely 4 hours before dawn on America's Pacific coast, creates unease among analysts trained to recognize unusual patterns. The Chinese submarine-launched ballistic missiles that lift off from positions in the Pacific Basin at 4:03 a.m. represent the culmination of months of careful positioning and preparation. The submarines themselves, advanced models incorporating stealth technology that renders them nearly invisible to American detection systems, have maintained station at optimal launch positions for weeks. Their crews, selected for psychological stability and ideological commitment, execute their orders with professional precision, despite understanding that their actions will trigger global nuclear warfare. The trajectory analysis conducted by American early warning systems reveals targets that confirm Chinese strategic objectives while demonstrating the sophistication of their planning. The missiles' paths indicate strikes against American command and control centers, nuclear weapons storage facilities, and the industrial infrastructure necessary for sustained warfare. Notably absent from the target list are major population centers, suggesting Chinese hopes that limited nuclear strikes might achieve strategic objectives without triggering total retaliation. The American detection of incoming missiles triggers automated response protocols that remove human decision-making from the initial stages of nuclear retaliation. The computer systems designed to ensure rapid response during nuclear crisis execute their programming with electronic precision, calculating optimal targets and launching procedures without requiring confirmation from political leaders. The automation that was intended to prevent paralysis during crisis instead eliminates opportunities for rational reconsideration of nuclear warfare's consequences. The submarine-launched missiles, following trajectories optimized for minimal detection time, approach their targets with velocities that compress decision-making intervals below the thresholds necessary for careful analysis. American radar operators tracking the incoming weapons have mere minutes to confirm their readings, communicate with command authorities, and implement protective measures. The temporal compression that characterizes nuclear warfare proves incompatible with the deliberation that rational decision-making requires. The first nuclear detonations occur over American military installations in California, Nevada, and Montana, creating electromagnetic pulses that disrupt communications and sensor systems across the western United States. The high-altitude explosions, designed to maximize electronic disruption rather than physical destruction, demonstrate Chinese attempts to achieve strategic objectives through precision targeting rather than indiscriminate devastation. The restraint that characterizes initial Chinese strikes reflects hopes that nuclear warfare might remain limited rather than escalating to mutual annihilation. The American retaliation, launched automatically by systems that interpret any nuclear attack as requiring immediate nuclear response, targets Chinese military facilities and industrial centers with precision weapons designed to minimize civilian casualties while eliminating strategic capabilities. American submarine-launched missiles, fired from positions maintained since the beginning of the crisis, follow trajectories that will deliver nuclear warheads to Chinese targets within 30 minutes of launch. The symmetry of submarine-launched nuclear attacks demonstrates how both sides developed similar strategic approaches to nuclear warfare. The communication failures that result from electromagnetic pulse effects eliminate most opportunities for political leaders to control the escalation of nuclear exchanges. American and Chinese command authorities, isolated from their military forces by disrupted communication systems, cannot issue orders to limit nuclear attacks or prevent automated systems from executing predetermined war plans. The technology that was supposed to ensure effective command and control during warfare instead creates conditions where warfare proceeds beyond human control. The early morning hours in European capitals see emergency meetings convened as intelligence services detect nuclear explosions in America and China. European leaders, awakened by intelligence briefings that confirm their worst fears about global nuclear warfare, face immediate decisions about whether to honor alliance commitments or attempt to remain neutral in humanity's final conflict. The European choices made during these early hours will determine whether nuclear warfare remains limited to American and Chinese territories, or expands to encompass the entire Northern Hemisphere. The global financial market's immediate response to news of nuclear attacks demonstrates the interconnected nature of atomic-age civilization and the impossibility of limiting nuclear warfare's effects to military targets. Electronic trading systems, disrupted by electromagnetic effects and panic selling, cease functioning within minutes of the first nuclear detonations. Currency values collapse as investors recognize that nuclear warfare makes traditional economic relationships meaningless. The economic dimension of nuclear warfare proves as destructive as its direct physical effects. The civilian populations of major cities, awakened by emergency broadcasts and air raid sirens, begin evacuation procedures that prove inadequate for the scale of nuclear warfare actually occurring. The civil defense systems designed for limited nuclear attacks cannot handle the psychological panic and logistical challenges that accompany multiple nuclear detonations. The breakdown of civilian evacuation procedures creates additional casualties and demonstrates the impossibility of protecting non-combatant populations during nuclear warfare conducted with atomic-age technology. The media coverage of the opening stages of nuclear warfare reflects both the dedication of journalists to inform the public and the technical impossibility of maintaining normal communication systems during nuclear conflict. Television and radio broadcasts, disrupted by electromagnetic pulse effects and the destruction of transmission facilities, provide fragmentary information that increases rather than reduces public panic. The information systems that sustained atomic-age civilization prove vulnerable to the weapons that civilization created. By 6:30 in the morning Pacific time, the electromagnetic effects of nuclear detonations have cascaded through global communication and transportation systems in ways that exceed the most pessimistic pre-war projections. The integrated nature of atomic-age technology, which created unprecedented efficiency during peacetime, proves to be a critical vulnerability during nuclear warfare, as the failure of individual components triggers systemic collapse of entire technological networks. The collapse of satellite communication systems eliminates the primary means of coordination between military forces and government authorities worldwide. The satellites themselves, hardened against radiation and electromagnetic interference, survive the nuclear detonations, but cannot function when ground-based control systems lose power or connectivity. Military commanders find themselves isolated from higher authorities and dependent on local initiative to continue operations that were planned as carefully coordinated global campaigns. The international financial system's complete breakdown demonstrates the impossibility of maintaining economic relationships during nuclear warfare. Electronic banking systems, dependent on continuous communication between financial centers, cease operating when electromagnetic pulse effects disrupt data transmission. Currency markets collapse as the physical destruction of financial centers eliminates the institutions that maintained monetary values. The economic foundation of international relations disappears within hours of the first nuclear attacks. Commercial aviation, the circulatory system of global civilization, faces complete paralysis as air traffic control systems fail and aircraft cannot navigate safely through airspace contaminated by radioactive fallout. Passenger aircraft in flight during the initial nuclear exchanges find themselves stranded at airports without fuel or maintenance support. International cargo shipments carrying the raw materials and finished goods that sustain atomic-age prosperity cease moving as transportation systems lose their organizational framework. The power grid failures that spread across continents demonstrate the vulnerability of electrical distribution systems to both direct attack and electromagnetic interference. Nuclear weapons targeted at power generation facilities create cascading failures that affect regions far from the initial detonations. Fusion reactors, the clean energy sources that powered atomic age prosperity, automatically shut down when their control systems detect anomalous conditions, leaving entire metropolitan areas without electricity. The darkness that falls across major cities becomes both literal and metaphorical as the lights of civilization flicker and die. The water treatment and distribution systems that sustain urban populations face immediate crisis as power failures eliminate the pumping stations and purification facilities that make city life possible. Municipal water supplies, dependent on continuous electrical power for processing and distribution, cease flowing within hours of power grid collapse. The reservoirs and aqueducts that bring water from distant sources cannot function without the technological infrastructure that nuclear warfare has destroyed. Urban populations that numbered in the millions face the prospect of thirst within days of the initial attacks. The food distribution networks that connect agricultural regions with urban consumers collapse as transportation systems fail and refrigeration facilities lose power. Supermarkets and grocery stores, stocked with perishable goods that require continuous cooling, face massive spoilage as backup power systems prove inadequate for extended outages. The just-in-time delivery systems that minimize storage costs during peacetime leave urban populations without food reserves when supply chains disintegrate. The abundance that characterized atomic-age civilization reveals itself as dependent on technological systems that prove fragile under attack. The medical systems that promise to eliminate disease and extend human lifespan face overwhelming challenges as hospitals lose power and communication with medical supply networks. Emergency rooms, designed for routine medical crises, cannot handle the radiation exposure cases and trauma injuries that nuclear warfare creates. Medical equipment dependent on electrical power ceases functioning, while pharmaceutical supplies trapped in damaged distribution centers cannot reach patients who need them. The medical miracles of the atomic age prove dependent on technological infrastructure that nuclear warfare eliminates. The emergency services that civilian populations depend on for protection during crisis prove inadequate for the scale of destruction that nuclear warfare creates. Fire departments cannot respond to the multiple conflagrations that nuclear detonations ignite, while police forces lose communication and mobility when their equipment fails. Rescue services find themselves unable to reach disaster areas due to radiation hazards and transportation breakdown. The social safety net that protected civilian populations during peacetime emergencies disintegrates under the unprecedented stresses of nuclear warfare. The industrial production systems that manufactured atomic-age prosperity cease operating as power failures, and supply chain disruptions eliminate their ability to function. Automated factories, dependent on continuous electrical supply and computerized control systems, shut down when their technological requirements cannot be met. Chemical plants and refineries, producing the basic materials that sustain modern civilization, become dangerous rather than productive as safety systems fail and hazardous materials escape containment. The industrial foundation of atomic-age civilization transforms from an asset into a liability within hours of nuclear attack. The educational institutions that preserved and transmitted human knowledge face destruction, not only of their physical facilities, but of their ability to maintain the technological systems that stored centuries of accumulated learning. Universities and research centers, with their computer networks and electronic databases, lose access to the information that defined atomic age intellectual achievement. Libraries and archives, dependent on climate control and security systems, cannot protect their collections from the environmental chaos that nuclear warfare creates. The knowledge base that enabled atomic age civilization faces destruction along with the civilization itself. The transportation networks that connected global civilization fragment as infrastructure damage and radiation hazards make movement dangerous or impossible. Highways become impassable due to electromagnetic pulse effects on vehicles and radiation contamination from nearby nuclear detonations. Railways cease operating when their electrical systems fail and their communication networks collapse. Shipping ports, targeted by nuclear weapons due to their strategic importance, cannot handle the vessels that arrive seeking refuge from the chaos at sea. The mobility that defined atomic age life disappears within hours of the first nuclear attacks. The government administrative systems that provided social services and maintained civil order prove incapable of functioning when their technological infrastructure fails. Civil service departments, dependent on computer networks and communication systems, cannot coordinate responses to the multiple crises that nuclear warfare creates. Social security systems, pension programs, and welfare services cease operating when their electronic records become inaccessible. The governmental services that citizens expected as entitlements of atomic age civilization evaporate, along with the technology that enabled them. The cultural and entertainment systems that provided meaning and pleasure during peacetime face destruction as their technological foundations collapse. Television and radio networks cease broadcasting when their transmission facilities lose power or suffer direct attack. Movie theaters and concert halls cannot operate without electrical systems for sound and lighting. The mass media that shaped atomic age culture and connected global audiences disappears, leaving populations isolated with only local sources of information and entertainment. The cultural unity that characterized atomic age civilization fragments along with its technological foundations. In the grey dawn of October 24th, 2077, the first survivors of the Great War emerged from their shelters to witness a world transformed beyond recognition. The cities that once gleamed with atomic age prosperity now lie in ruins, their glass towers reduced to radioactive rubble, their streets littered with the detritus of a civilization that reached too high and fell too hard. The air itself carries the bitter taste of fallout and the acrid smell of fires that burn unchecked through the remains of human achievement. The Vault-Tec emergency shelters, designed and marketed as humanity's insurance against atomic warfare, proved to be both salvation and prison for their occupants. Vault 111, nestled beneath the suburbs of Boston, contains its residents in cryogenic suspension that will preserve them for centuries, while the radiation above slowly decays to manageable levels. The automated systems that maintain the vault function with mechanical precision, caring for their human cargo, while the world they once knew crumbles into archaeological layers above their heads. Other vaults serve different purposes, revealing the cynical experimentation that Vault-Tec conducted under the guise of survival preparation. Vault 81, with its secret medical experiments, demonstrates how corporate interests exploited the fear of nuclear warfare to conduct research that peacetime ethics would never have permitted. The inhabitants who trusted their lives to Vault-Tec's promises discover that survival came with costs they never agreed to pay, their descendants bearing the burden of choices made in desperation during humanity's final hour. The government officials who retreat to secure bunkers find themselves rulers of nothing, their authority extending only as far as their shelter's walls. The enclave, that shadow organization of corporate and political elites, emerges from their refuges to discover that the America they sought to control has been reduced to ash and radiation. Their pre-war plans for post-war dominance prove meaningless when the infrastructure necessary for governance has been eliminated, along with the populations they intended to govern. Military installations, hardened against nuclear attack, become islands of organization in a sea of chaos. The soldiers who survive in these facilities face the psychological challenge of maintaining military discipline and purpose when their chain of command has been vaporized and their mission has become survival rather than victory. Some adapt to their new role as protectors of civilian survivors, while others cling to military protocol that has become meaningless in the post-war reality. The civilian populations who survive in improvised shelters emerge to face challenges that their atomic age education never prepared them to meet. Suburban families, accustomed to electrical appliances and supermarket abundance, must learn to find water, grow food, and defend themselves without the technological support systems they had always taken for granted. Many possess university degrees in subjects that prove useless for post-apocalyptic survival, while lacking the practical skills that subsistence living requires. Rural populations, already more self-sufficient than their urban counterparts, adapt more successfully to post-war conditions while facing their own unique challenges. Farmers who survived the initial attacks discover that their crops are contaminated by radioactive fallout, their livestock sickened by radiation exposure, and their equipment disabled by electromagnetic pulse effects. The agricultural foundation that might feed surviving populations requires reconstruction with primitive tools and contaminated resources. The children who experience the Great War as their introduction to life develop psychological adaptations that distinguish them from adults who remember the pre-war world. These young survivors, traumatized by events beyond their comprehension, nevertheless prove remarkably adaptable to post-war conditions. They learn to navigate radiation hazards, scavenge useful materials, and survive in environments that would paralyze adults accustomed to technological convenience. Their adaptability becomes both hope for human survival and evidence of how profoundly the war has changed human experience. Medical emergencies proliferate as radiation exposure creates health problems that surviving medical personnel lack the resources to treat effectively. Radiation sickness affects thousands of survivors who received sublethal doses during the initial attacks or their aftermath. Medical facilities that survived the war cannot provide treatment when pharmaceutical supplies are exhausted, and medical equipment requires electrical power that no longer exists. The promise of atomic-age medicine gives way to primitive healthcare based on herbal remedies and basic surgical techniques. The psychological trauma that affects virtually all survivors creates mental health challenges that overwhelm any surviving psychiatric resources. Post-traumatic stress disorder becomes a universal condition among populations that witnessed the destruction of their civilization and the deaths of most people they knew. Depression and anxiety reach epidemic levels as survivors struggle to find meaning and hope in circumstances that seem to negate both. The mental health crisis compounds the physical challenges of post-war survival, while eliminating many individuals' capacity to contribute to recovery efforts. The social reorganization that begins among survivor groups reveals both human adaptability and the fragility of civilized behavior under extreme stress. Some communities cooperate effectively, sharing resources and responsibilities to maximize their collective survival chances. Others fragment into competing factions that waste energy on internal conflicts, while external threats remain unaddressed. The social skills that sustained atomic age communities prove inadequate for the challenges of post-apocalyptic survival. The religious responses to the Great War range from despair to renewed faith, as survivors struggle to understand how divine providence could permit such comprehensive destruction. Some religious leaders interpret the war as divine judgment on human pride and technological hubris, calling for repentance and return to simpler ways of life. Others lose their faith entirely when confronted with suffering on scales that challenge traditional theodicies. The spiritual dimension of recovery proves as complex as its physical and social aspects. The radioactive contamination that blankets vast areas of the former civilized world creates immediate health hazards that kill many survivors who initially escaped the direct effects of nuclear explosions. The invisible danger of radiation proves particularly insidious because its effects develop over time, allowing false hope among populations that believe they have survived the worst of the catastrophe. Acute radiation syndrome affects thousands of survivors who received high doses during the initial attacks, or while traveling through contaminated areas during evacuation attempts. The progression from initial nausea through hair loss, immune system failure, and eventual death creates a medical crisis that surviving healthcare facilities cannot adequately address. Medical personnel lacking radiation monitoring equipment and treatment protocols can only provide supportive care while watching patients die from a condition that atomic age medicine promised to prevent. The contamination of water supplies creates immediate survival challenges, as survivors must choose between dehydration and radiation exposure. Wells, springs, and surface water sources throughout the affected regions carry radioactive isotopes that will accumulate in human tissues over time. Water purification techniques that might remove radiological contamination require equipment and expertise that post-war conditions cannot provide. Populations face the cruel choice between immediate death from thirst and slow death from radiation poisoning. Agricultural contamination eliminates food sources that might sustain survivor populations while creating additional exposure pathways through consumption of contaminated crops and livestock. Vegetables that concentrate radioactive isotopes in their tissues become dangerous to consume, while livestock that graze on contaminated vegetation carry radiation in their meat and milk. The food chain that might support post-war recovery instead becomes a mechanism for continuing radiation exposure that affects human health for generations. The interaction between radiation exposure and existing health conditions accelerates mortality among survivor populations that include many elderly and infirm individuals. Cancer rates increase dramatically as radiation exposure triggers malignant cell growth, while immune system depression leaves survivors vulnerable to infections that would normally be manageable. The compound effects of radiation and other health stresses create mortality rates that continue to reduce survivor populations months after the initial attacks. Genetic damage from radiation exposure affects reproductive health in ways that threaten the long-term viability of human populations in contaminated areas. Increased rates of birth defects, stillbirths, and infertility reduce the reproductive capacity of survivor communities while creating additional healthcare challenges. The genetic heritage that might enable human recovery faces damage that may affect multiple generations, creating questions about whether populations exposed to high radiation levels can maintain viable breeding populations. The psychological effects of radiation exposure add mental health dimensions to the physical health crisis, as survivors develop anxiety about their exposure levels and future health prospects. The knowledge that radiation exposure may cause cancer or genetic damage creates chronic stress that affects survivor morale and social cohesion. Uncertainty about exposure levels and health risks makes planning for the future more difficult, while increasing present suffering through anticipatory anxiety. Radiation monitoring becomes impossible for most survivor populations when the instruments and expertise necessary for measuring contamination levels are unavailable. Survivors must make decisions about where to travel, what to eat, and where to establish communities without reliable information about radiation hazards. The inability to measure radiation creates additional uncertainty that complicates survival planning, while potentially leading to exposure levels that could have been avoided with better information. The variations in radiation levels across different geographic areas create complex patterns of habitability that survivors must navigate without adequate information or guidance. Some areas that receive direct nuclear strikes may have lower long-term radiation levels than areas that received heavy fallout from distant explosions. The unpredictable nature of radiation distribution makes it difficult for survivors to identify safe areas for long-term settlement while avoiding unnecessarily dangerous exposures. Environmental radiation affects wildlife populations in ways that disrupt ecological relationships and reduce the biological resources available to human survivors. Many animal species suffer population crashes due to radiation exposure, while others develop mutations that affect their behavior and reproductive success. The ecological disruption that results from radiation exposure reduces the carrying capacity of post-war environments, while eliminating wildlife resources that humans might have used for food and other purposes. Plant life in contaminated areas shows various responses to radiation exposure, with some species proving more radiation resistant than others. Agricultural crops generally show reduced yields and increased mutation rates in contaminated soils, while some wild plants adapt to high radiation environments. The botanical changes that result from radiation exposure alter the appearance and productivity of post-war landscapes, while affecting the plant resources available to human survivors. The accumulation of radioactive materials in the food chain creates long-term health hazards that persist long after initial radiation levels decline. Radioactive isotopes concentrate in certain organs and tissues, creating internal radiation sources that continue exposing survivors to harmful radiation for years or decades. The biological concentration of radiation ensures that health effects continue to manifest long after the immediate crisis passes, affecting survivor health and reproductive capacity for generations. The formation of survivor communities represents humanity's first attempt to rebuild social organization in the aftermath of civilizational collapse. These early settlements, established in the weeks and months following the Great War, demonstrate both the resilience of human social instincts and the enormous challenges facing post-apocalyptic society. Megaton, built around an unexploded nuclear bomb in the ruins of Washington, D.C., becomes one of the most successful early survivor settlements. The community that grows up around this symbol of potential destruction develops a unique culture that combines pragmatic scavenging with religious reverence for atomic power. The settlement's walls, constructed from airplane fuselages and salvaged metal, provide security, while its central bomb serves as both shrine and reminder of the power that destroyed the old world. The residents of Megaton develop survival strategies that become models for other post-war communities. Their emphasis on scavenging useful materials from the ruins of civilization provides resources for construction and daily life, while their trading relationships with other survivor groups create the beginnings of post-war commerce. The community's leadership structure, based on practical contribution rather than pre-war credentials, demonstrates how social organization adapts to post-apocalyptic realities. Tenpenny Tower represents a different approach to post-war survival. As wealthy pre-war elites attempt to maintain their privileged lifestyle despite civilizational collapse, the tower's exclusive membership policies and luxury amenities create a bubble of pre-war normalcy, but at the cost of isolation from other survivor communities and dependence on resources that may prove unsustainable. The contrast between Tenpenny Tower's artificial luxury and Megaton's practical adaptation illustrates different philosophical approaches to post-war survival. Canterbury Commons emerges as a trading hub where survivor communities can exchange goods and services without the overhead of permanent settlement. The community's focus on facilitating commerce between other settlements provides essential economic functions, while demonstrating how specialization can emerge even under post-apocalyptic conditions. The success of Canterbury Commons suggests that trade relationships may prove crucial for long-term recovery efforts. Rivet City, established in the remains of an aircraft carrier, demonstrates how pre-war infrastructure can be adapted for post-war survival. The ship's nuclear reactor provides electrical power that makes possible amenities unavailable to other survivor communities, while its defensible position offers security against raiders and mutant creatures. The community's scientific capabilities, preserved from pre-war personnel and equipment, provide medical and technical services that benefit the broader survivor population. Big Town illustrates the challenges facing survivor communities that lack strong leadership or adequate defenses. The settlement's vulnerability to raider attacks and internal disputes demonstrates how post-war communities can fail when they cannot maintain security and social cohesion. The problems that plague Big Town become cautionary examples for other survivor groups attempting to establish permanent settlements. The Republic of Dave represents an extreme example of how pre-war individuals attempt to maintain authority in post-war conditions. Dave's declaration of independence, an assumption of presidential powers over his small settlement, demonstrates both the flexibility of political arrangements under survival conditions and the limitations of authority that lacks practical foundation. The micronation's survival depends more on its isolation than its governmental structure. Arafu, built on a highway overpass, demonstrates how survivor communities adapt existing infrastructure for defensive purposes while maintaining connections to transportation networks. The settlement's elevated position provides security advantages, while its location on former trade routes facilitates contact with other communities. The architectural adaptation that Arafu represents becomes a model for other communities seeking to balance security with accessibility. Greyditch faces unique challenges when its inhabitants must deal with mutant ant infestations that threaten the community's survival. The settlement's struggle against post-war biological hazards demonstrates how environmental changes create new threats that survivor communities must address without adequate resources or expertise. The scientific approach that some Greyditch residents adopt toward understanding mutant creatures becomes important for developing countermeasures. Paradise Falls reveals the dark side of post-war social organization, as some survivor communities turn to slavery and exploitation rather than cooperation. The settlement's economy, based on capturing and selling other survivors, demonstrates how desperate conditions can lead to the abandonment of moral principles that seemed fundamental during peacetime. The existence of Paradise Falls creates external threats that other communities must defend against, while raising questions about what values are worth preserving from the pre-war world. Oasis presents a unique case of post-war community organization around religious devotion to a mutated individual who appears to possess unusual powers. The settlement's isolation and distinctive culture demonstrate how post-war communities can develop in radically different directions from pre-war social norms. The religious dimension of Oasis suggests that spiritual needs continue to influence community formation, even under survival conditions. Underworld, established in the ruins of Washington, D.C. Museum of History, becomes a refuge for ghoul populations that face discrimination from human survivors. The community's formation around shared identity as radiation-mutated individuals demonstrates how post-war social divisions may develop along biological rather than traditional cultural lines. The relationship between underworld and human settlements becomes a model for intergroup relations in post-war society. The transformation of the former United States into what survivors begin calling the wasteland represents more than just physical destruction. It marks the emergence of a new form of human civilization adapted to post-nuclear conditions. The early months following the Great War see the development of new social norms, economic systems, and cultural values that will define human society for generations. The concept of caps, bottle caps from Nuka-Cola and other beverages, as a universal currency emerges from the practical needs of post-war trade. The durability, scarcity, and divisibility of bottle caps make them ideal for small-scale transactions, while their pre-war association with consumer culture provides psychological familiarity. The adoption of caps as currency demonstrates how post-war society creates new institutions from the debris of the old world. The emergence of caravans as the primary means of long-distance trade and communication represents the development of post-war economic networks. These trading expeditions, heavily armed and carefully planned, carry goods and information between survivor settlements while facing constant dangers from raiders, mutant creatures, and radiation hazards. The caravan system becomes the circulatory system of post-war civilization, enabling specialization and exchange that would otherwise be impossible. The development of scavenging as a primary economic activity creates new social roles and skills that have no pre-war equivalent. Professional scavengers learn to identify valuable materials in the ruins of civilization, developing expertise in electronics, metallurgy, and engineering that enables them to extract useful resources from destroyed infrastructure. The scavenging economy provides the material foundation for post-war reconstruction, while creating employment for survivors who possess the courage and skill to venture into dangerous ruins. The adaptation of pre-war technology for post-war conditions becomes a crucial survival skill as survivors learn to repair and modify equipment without access to original manufacturing specifications or replacement parts. Jury rigging, improvisation, and cannibalization of equipment become essential techniques for maintaining the technological tools that provide advantages in post-war survival. The technical knowledge that emerges from these adaptations creates the foundation for eventual technological recovery. The formation of raider gangs represents the dark side of post-war social organization, as some survivors choose predation over production as their survival strategy. These groups, often led by charismatic psychopaths, prey on productive communities while contributing nothing to post-war recovery. The existence of raider threats forces other survivor communities to invest resources in defense rather than development, slowing overall recovery while creating cycles of violence that perpetuate instability. The mutation of wildlife creates new environmental challenges and opportunities as radiation exposure alters biological relationships throughout post-war ecosystems. Rad scorpions, mutated from common scorpions, become dangerous predators that threaten human settlements, while two-headed Brahmin provide livestock adapted to post-war conditions. The biological changes that result from radiation exposure require survivors to develop new knowledge about their environment while providing resources unavailable in the pre-war world. The emergence of ghouls as a distinct post-human population creates complex social and ethical questions about identity and rights in post-war society. These radiation-mutated individuals retain human intelligence and memory while suffering physical transformations that mark them as fundamentally different from normal humans. The relationship between ghouls and unmutated humans becomes a defining issue in post-war social development, testing whether post-war society can maintain humanitarian values under survival conditions. The development of new medical practices adapted to post-war conditions occurs as surviving medical personnel learn to treat radiation exposure, mutation-related conditions, and trauma injuries without access to pre-war pharmaceutical supplies or medical equipment. Stim packs, developed from pre-war medical technology, become the standard treatment for injuries, while Radaway provides limited treatment for radiation exposure. The medical knowledge that emerges from post-war necessity creates the foundation for healthcare systems adapted to wasteland conditions. The establishment of new educational systems occurs as survivor communities recognize the need to transmit both pre-war knowledge and post-war survival skills to younger generations. The curriculum that emerges from these efforts combines basic literacy and numeracy with practical skills like weapon maintenance, radiation detection, and scavenging techniques. The educational programs that develop in early survivor communities determine what knowledge from the old world will be preserved and how post-war generations will understand their history. The creation of new entertainment and cultural activities demonstrates humanity's need for meaning and pleasure even under survival conditions. The gladiatorial combat that some communities organize provides both entertainment and a means of settling disputes, while storytelling traditions preserve pre-war memories and create new myths adapted to post-war realities. The cultural activities that emerge in survivor communities become the seeds of post-war civilization's artistic and intellectual development. The development of new religious and philosophical movements reflects survivor attempts to understand the meaning of civilizational collapse and find hope for the future. The Church of Atom, which venerates nuclear power as a divine force, represents one attempt to find spiritual meaning in the destruction of the old world. Other religious movements emphasize traditional values as anchors of stability in chaotic times, while secular philosophies focus on practical ethics for survival conditions. The formation of new governance structures occurs as survivor communities develop systems for making collective decisions and resolving disputes without access to pre-war legal and political institutions. Some communities develop democratic procedures adapted to small-scale face-to-face societies, while others adopt more authoritarian structures based on military hierarchy or personal charisma. The governmental experiments that occur in early survivor communities provide models for larger-scale political organization as post-war society develops. The Great War's impact on human civilization extends far beyond the immediate destruction of cities and infrastructure to encompass fundamental changes in how humans relate to their environment, their technology, and each other. The post-war world that emerges from the ashes of atomic age civilization bears little resemblance to the society that existed before October 23, 2077, representing a break in human history as significant as the agricultural or industrial revolutions. The physical transformation of the landscape creates environmental conditions that will affect human survival for centuries. The radioactive contamination that spreads across vast areas alters soil chemistry, water quality, and atmospheric conditions in ways that make traditional agricultural and settlement patterns impossible. Survivors must learn to navigate a world where invisible dangers lurk in familiar places, where the rain brings poison rather than life, and where the very ground beneath their feet may be lethal to touch. The biological consequences of radiation exposure create new forms of life that become permanent features of post-war ecology. The mutations that affect both plant and animal species generate evolutionary pressures that accelerate biological change while creating creatures adapted to high radiation environments. These new organisms fill ecological niches left vacant by species that could not adapt to post-nuclear conditions, creating ecosystems that function according to principles unknown in the pre-war world. The technological regression that follows the Great War occurs not simply because of infrastructure destruction, but because the specialized knowledge required to maintain atomic-age technology cannot be preserved without the educational and industrial systems that supported it. Complex manufacturing processes, scientific research methods, and engineering practices become lost arts. As the individuals who possessed such knowledge die or become unable to transmit it to subsequent generations, the technological decline that characterizes post-war society represents the loss of centuries of accumulated human learning. The social structures that emerge in post-war communities reflect both continuity with pre-war traditions and adaptation to survival conditions that render many traditional social roles obsolete. Leadership patterns change as practical competence becomes more important than pre-war credentials or inherited status. Gender roles evolve as survival necessities override traditional divisions of labor. Family structures adapt to circumstances where biological relationships may be less important than mutual dependence for survival. The economic systems that develop in the wasteland operate according to principles that combine pre-war market mechanisms with barter relationships adapted to scarcity conditions. Money as a store of value and medium of exchange persists in modified forms, but wealth accumulation becomes less important than immediate access to survival resources. Trade relationships focus on essential goods rather than luxury items, while service industries adapt to provide skills needed for wasteland survival rather than pre-war convenience. The cultural values that emerge from post-war society reflect the psychological impact of surviving civilizational collapse while maintaining human identity under conditions that test the limits of human adaptability. The optimism that characterized atomic age culture gives way to pragmatic acceptance of danger and uncertainty as permanent features of human existence. Individual self-reliance becomes more highly valued than social cooperation, though community solidarity remains essential for survival. The educational priorities that develop in post-war society emphasize practical skills over abstract knowledge, as survivors recognize that traditional academic subjects provide little advantage under wasteland conditions. Literacy and numeracy remain important, but technical skills like weapon maintenance, medical treatment, and resource identification become equally crucial for survival. The educational content that emerges from post-war necessity shapes how future generations understand their world and their place within it. The religious and philosophical responses to the Great War create new belief systems that attempt to provide meaning and hope in circumstances that challenge traditional sources of both. Some post-war religious movements emphasize the redemptive potential of suffering and destruction, while others focus on practical ethics for survival conditions. Secular philosophies that emerge from post-war experience tend to emphasize individual responsibility and community cooperation as essential values for human survival. The artistic and intellectual culture that develops in the wasteland reflects both preservation of pre-war traditions and creative adaptation to post-war realities. Music, literature, and visual arts that emerge from survivor communities often combine pre-war forms with themes and subjects drawn from post-war experience. The creative expression that occurs under survival conditions demonstrates humanity's continued need for beauty and meaning, even in the harshest circumstances. The political structures that emerge in post-war society range from anarchistic individualism to authoritarian collectivism, as different communities experiment with governance systems adapted to their particular circumstances. Democratic traditions persist in modified forms, where conditions permit deliberative decision-making, while more autocratic systems develop where immediate survival necessities require rapid decision-making and strong leadership. The governmental experiments that occur in post-war communities provide models for larger political organizations as society gradually rebuilds. The legal systems that develop in survivor communities adapt pre-war legal principles to post-war conditions, while creating new legal categories to address situations that pre-war law never contemplated. Property rights must be redefined when traditional ownership becomes meaningless, and possession often determines survival. Criminal law adapts to circumstances where state authority may be minimal, and community justice becomes a matter of collective survival rather than abstract principle. The technological development that occurs in post-war society combines preservation of useful pre-war knowledge with innovation adapted to resource constraints and survival necessities. The technological trajectory that emerges from post-war conditions may eventually lead to capabilities that exceed pre-war achievements, but along pathways that differ significantly from the direction atomic age technology was following before the war. The technological culture that develops in the wasteland emphasizes durability, maintainability, and resource efficiency over the performance optimization that characterized pre-war engineering. The political and social organizations that emerge from the ruins of the Great War reflect both human adaptability and the profound impact that civilizational collapse has on social structures. These factions, ranging from quasi-governmental entities to religious movements to military organizations, shape the development of post-war society while competing for resources and influence in the transformed world. The new California Republic represents the most ambitious attempt to recreate pre-war governmental structures under post-war conditions. Founded by survivors who remember democratic traditions and believe in the possibility of restoring civilized government, the NCR attempts to provide services and protection to wasteland communities while maintaining constitutional principles adapted to post-apocalyptic realities. Their success in establishing territorial control and bureaucratic administration demonstrates that complex government can function under wasteland conditions, though at the cost of resources that might otherwise be used for immediate survival needs. The Brotherhood of Steel emerges from military personnel who survived the Great War and dedicate themselves to preserving technological knowledge and preventing the misuse of dangerous technology. Their quasi-religious devotion to technology preservation and their military organization make them effective at recovering and protecting advanced equipment. But their exclusivity and technological hoarding create tensions with other survivor groups. The Brotherhood's approach to post-war challenges emphasizes control and preservation over innovation and distribution. Caesar's Legion represents an authoritarian response to post-war chaos that emphasizes order and discipline over individual freedom or democratic participation. Built around the personality and philosophy of their leader, the Legion attempts to create stability through military conquest and cultural assimilation of defeated populations. Their success in establishing territorial control demonstrates the effectiveness of authoritarian organization under anarchic conditions, though at the cost of individual rights and cultural diversity that many survivors consider essential to human civilization. The Enclave consists of pre-war government and corporate officials who claim to represent the legitimate continuation of the United States government. Their access to advanced technology and military equipment makes them formidable, but their exclusivist ideology and genocidal intentions toward mutated populations limit their potential for building broad-based support. The Enclave's approach to post-war recovery emphasizes genetic purity and technological superiority as the foundations for rebuilding civilization. The Church of Atom develops as a religious movement that interprets the Great War as a divine revelation about the sacred nature of nuclear energy. Their worship of radiation and atomic power provides spiritual meaning for survivors struggling to understand the catastrophe that destroyed their world, while their acceptance of radiation exposure creates unique adaptations to post-war environmental conditions. The Church's influence extends beyond religious practice to affect how communities approach radiation hazards and technological development. The Institute represents a secretive organization of pre-war scientists who survived in underground facilities and continue advanced research using technologies that exceed pre-war capabilities. Their development of synthetic humans and other advanced technologies makes them potentially powerful actors in post-war society. But their secrecy and manipulation of surface populations create suspicion and hostility among other factions. The Institute's approach to post-war challenges emphasizes scientific advancement over democratic participation or individual rights. The Railroad emerges as an underground organization dedicated to helping synthetic humans escape from servitude and establish independent lives. Their humanitarian mission reflects continued commitment to individual rights and human dignity under conditions where such values are often subordinated to survival necessities. The Railroad's activities create conflicts with other factions, while demonstrating that moral principles can motivate organized action, even under post-apocalyptic conditions. The Minutemen represent a decentralized militia movement that emphasizes local self-defense and mutual aid between wasteland communities. Their democratic organization and focus on protecting civilian populations reflects pre-war American traditions adapted to post-war security needs. The Minutemen's effectiveness depends on voluntary cooperation rather than hierarchical command, making them flexible but sometimes ineffective in coordinating large-scale operations. The Children of the Cathedral combine religious motivation with social action in attempts to help wasteland communities while spreading their interpretation of post-war spiritual needs. Their humanitarian activities provide genuine assistance to survivor populations, but their religious agenda and connections to other organizations create complications for communities that accept their aid. The Children's approach demonstrates how religious organizations can provide social services under conditions where secular institutions prove inadequate. The followers of the apocalypse emerge as an educational and medical organization dedicated to preserving knowledge and providing healthcare services to wasteland populations. Their secular humanitarianism and emphasis on education and medical care makes them valuable allies for many communities, though their pacifist principles sometimes limit their effectiveness in violent conflicts. The followers demonstrate how professional expertise can be organized for humanitarian purposes under post-war conditions. The Gunrunners develop as a commercial organization specializing in weapons manufacturing and trade. Their technical expertise and business focus make them important suppliers of military equipment for other factions, while their neutral stance in political conflicts allows them to trade with multiple parties. The Gunrunners demonstrate how specialized economic functions can emerge and thrive under wasteland conditions when they address genuine needs. Raider groups, while not constituting a single faction, represent a common form of post-war social organization based on predation rather than production. These groups vary widely in size, organization, and methods, but they share a focus on taking resources from other communities rather than creating wealth through their own efforts. The persistence of raider activity demonstrates how civilizational collapse can lead to the abandonment of cooperative social norms in favor of purely selfish survival strategies. Trading companies and caravan organizations emerge as crucial economic institutions that enable commerce between survivor communities, while providing employment for individuals with the skills and courage necessary for wasteland travel. These commercial organizations often develop their own security forces and diplomatic relationships, making them influential actors in post-war politics despite their primarily economic focus. The success of trading organizations demonstrates the importance of commerce for post-war recovery and development. The fate of human technological knowledge in the aftermath of the Great War represents one of the most significant long-term consequences of nuclear conflict, determining not only the material conditions of post-war life, but also the trajectory of human development for generations. The complex process of technological preservation and loss shapes every aspect of post-war society, while creating opportunities and challenges that will define the future of human civilization. The immediate destruction of manufacturing infrastructure eliminates humanity's ability to produce the complex technological systems that defined atomic age civilization. The specialized facilities required for electronics manufacturing, pharmaceutical production, and precision engineering cease to exist, while the supply chains that connected raw materials to finished products disintegrate. This industrial collapse forces post-war society to depend on scavenged pre-war equipment, while gradually losing the capability to maintain and repair such devices. The loss of educational institutions and trained personnel creates gaps in technological knowledge that prove difficult to bridge through informal learning processes. Universities and research facilities that preserved centuries of accumulated scientific understanding are destroyed or abandoned, while the professors and researchers who possessed advanced technical knowledge die or become unable to transmit their expertise to students. The educational systems that might have preserved technological knowledge for future generations cannot function without the infrastructure and social organization that nuclear warfare eliminated. The fragmentation of technological knowledge occurs as different survivor communities preserve different aspects of pre-war technology, while losing access to the comprehensive understanding that made atomic age innovation possible. Some communities maintain expertise in medical technology while losing mechanical engineering knowledge, while others preserve weapons manufacturing capabilities but cannot maintain electronic systems. This specialization, while necessary for survival, creates technological gaps that may never be completely filled. The Brotherhood of Steel's approach to technology preservation represents the most systematic attempt to maintain pre-war technological knowledge, but their methods create both opportunities and limitations for technological development. Their careful cataloging and protection of technological artifacts preserves important knowledge, while their secretive and exclusivist policies prevent widespread distribution of technological benefits. The Brotherhood's success in preserving technology comes at the cost of limiting innovation and adaptation that might better serve post-war conditions. The adaptation of pre-war technology for post-war conditions becomes a crucial skill as survivors learn to modify existing equipment for purposes its original designers never intended. Vehicles designed for peacetime transportation are converted into armored combat platforms, while electronic systems are jury-rigged to function with limited power supplies and improvised components. These adaptations demonstrate human ingenuity while revealing how technological development can continue even under resource constraints. The development of new technologies specifically adapted to post-war conditions occurs as survivors combine preserved pre-war knowledge with innovations designed to address unique wasteland challenges. Radiation detection and treatment technologies advance beyond pre-war capabilities as survival necessities drive innovation in fields that received limited attention before the war. Water purification, food preservation, and defensive systems develop along trajectories that differ significantly from pre-war technological development. The loss of digital information systems represents a particularly significant challenge for technological preservation, as electronic storage media prove vulnerable to electromagnetic pulse effects and decay over time without proper maintenance. Computer databases containing vast amounts of technical information become inaccessible when the systems required to read them cease functioning, while internet-based knowledge repositories disappear entirely. The information revolution that preceded the Great War proves fragile when the infrastructure supporting it is destroyed. The preservation of manufacturing knowledge faces unique challenges, as the complex processes required to produce advanced materials and components cannot be maintained without continuous practice and expensive equipment. Metallurgy, chemistry, and precision manufacturing techniques become lost arts, as the facilities and personnel required to practice them disappear. Even when theoretical knowledge survives, the practical skills required to implement technological processes may be lost permanently. The role of technical documentation in preserving technological knowledge becomes crucial, as written manuals and specifications provide the only means of transmitting complex technical information across generations. Communities that possess comprehensive technical libraries maintain advantages in preserving and developing technology, while those that lack documentation face gradual technological decline. The survival of technical knowledge depends as much on preserving information as on maintaining physical artifacts. The emergence of new technological development paths occurs as post-war communities combine preserved knowledge with innovations adapted to their specific conditions and resources. These alternative technological trajectories may eventually lead to capabilities that exceed pre-war achievements, but along routes that differ significantly from the direction atomic age development was following. The technological culture that emerges from post-war necessity emphasizes sustainability, maintainability, and resource efficiency over the performance optimization that characterized pre-war engineering. The integration of pre-war and post-war technologies creates hybrid systems that combine the best features of both approaches while compensating for the limitations of each. Advanced pre-war components are incorporated into simpler systems that can be maintained with post-war resources, while post-war innovations enhance the functionality of preserved pre-war equipment. These hybrid approaches demonstrate how technological development can continue, even when access to original design and manufacturing capabilities is lost. The social organization of technological development changes dramatically in post-war conditions. As the institutional frameworks that supported atomic age research and development no longer exist, individual inventors and small workshops replace large corporate research departments, while market mechanisms rather than government funding determine technological priorities. The social context in which technology develops affects both the direction of innovation and the distribution of technological benefits throughout post-war society. The civilization that ended with the Great War represents not merely a collection of physical artifacts and social institutions, but a unique moment in human history when technological capability, social organization, and cultural achievement created possibilities that may never exist again. Understanding what was lost in those final hours of October 23rd, 2077, provides perspective on both the magnitude of the catastrophe and the challenges facing any attempt at civilizational recovery. The global communication networks that enabled instant contact between any 2 points on Earth created a level of human connectivity that fundamentally altered social, economic, and political relationships. The ability to share information, coordinate activities, and maintain relationships across vast distances made possible forms of cooperation and cultural exchange that enriched human experience while enabling unprecedented levels of economic and intellectual development. The loss of global communication returns human society to patterns of isolation and regionalism that constrain both individual opportunity and collective achievement. The educational systems that preserved and transmitted the accumulated knowledge of centuries represented humanity's greatest achievement in ensuring that each generation could build upon the accomplishments of its predecessors. Universities, libraries, and research institutions maintained not only factual information, but also the methods of inquiry and analysis that enabled continued learning and discovery. The destruction of these educational resources condemns post-war society to rediscovering knowledge that was already known, while lacking the systematic approaches that made such knowledge possible. The medical knowledge and capabilities that promised to eliminate disease and extend human lifespan represented the culmination of centuries of scientific investigation into the nature of life and health. The pharmaceutical industry, medical equipment manufacturing, and trained healthcare personnel that supported atomic age medicine provided health services that dramatically improved quality of life while extending life expectancy to unprecedented levels. The loss of medical capabilities condemns post-war populations to suffer from diseases and conditions that pre-war medicine could easily prevent or treat. The industrial infrastructure that manufactured the goods and services of atomic age civilization represented an integrated system of remarkable complexity and efficiency. The supply chains that connected raw materials to finished products spanned continents, while employing millions of people in specialized roles that contributed to collective prosperity. The manufacturing capabilities that produced everything from household appliances to spacecraft-enabled standards of living that would have seemed miraculous to earlier generations. The transportation networks that enabled rapid movement of people and goods created a level of mobility that transformed human experience while enabling economic and social relationships impossible under previous conditions. Commercial aviation, highway systems, and shipping networks made possible careers, relationships, and cultural exchanges that enriched individual lives while contributing to collective human development. The loss of transportation infrastructure returns human society to the geographic constraints that limited earlier civilizations. The artistic and cultural achievements that flourished under atomic age conditions represented new forms of creative expression enabled by technological capabilities and social organization unique to that period. The mass media that distributed entertainment, information, and artistic works created shared cultural experiences that connected diverse populations while providing individual enrichment and pleasure. The cultural production that characterized atomic age civilization may never be replicated under post-war conditions that prioritize survival over aesthetic achievement. The scientific research capabilities that advanced human understanding of the natural world represented the systematic application of human intelligence to unlocking the secrets of the universe. The research institutions, experimental facilities, and trained scientists that conducted atomic age research generated knowledge that improved human life, while satisfying intellectual curiosity about fundamental questions. The loss of scientific capabilities eliminates humanity's best hope for understanding and potentially reversing the environmental damage that the Great War created. The social institutions that provided security, justice, and opportunity for individual development represented centuries of political and legal evolution towards systems that balanced individual rights with collective needs. Democratic governments, legal systems, and civil rights protections created frameworks for human flourishing that enabled both personal fulfillment and social progress. The collapse of these institutions eliminates the social foundations necessary for the kind of individual development and collective achievement that atomic age civilization made possible. The economic systems that created unprecedented prosperity while enabling specialization and innovation represented sophisticated methods for coordinating human activity and allocating resources efficiently. Market mechanisms, financial institutions, and international trade relationships created wealth on scales that previous civilizations could not imagine, while providing opportunities for individual advancement through merit and effort. The destruction of economic infrastructure eliminates the material foundation necessary for supporting large populations at high standards of living. The international cooperation that addressed global challenges through multilateral institutions and shared commitments represented humanity's best hope for managing problems that transcended national boundaries. Environmental protection, disease control, and conflict resolution through international organizations demonstrated the possibility of subordinating narrow interests to broader human welfare. The collapse of international cooperation eliminates mechanisms for addressing global problems that individual communities cannot solve independently. The technological integration that connected diverse systems into seamless networks of remarkable capability and efficiency represented the pinnacle of human engineering achievement. The electrical grids, communication networks, and computer systems that enabled atomic age civilization demonstrated how complex technologies could be coordinated to serve human needs while maintaining reliability and performance. The destruction of integrated technological systems eliminates capabilities that may require centuries to recreate, if they can be recreated at all under post-war conditions. As our long journey through the Great War's timeline draws to its gentle close, let your mind drift peacefully through the images we've explored together. Picture the world as it was in those golden years of the 21st century. The gleaming cities with their fusion-powered lights, the families gathering around dinner tables in their atomic-age homes, the children playing with toy rockets while dreaming of adventures among the stars. Think of the scientists and engineers who worked so diligently to harness the power of the atom for humanity's benefit, never knowing that their greatest achievements would become the instruments of civilization's end. See the diplomats and leaders who struggled to find peaceful solutions to resource scarcity, their efforts noble even in failure. Remember the ordinary people who went about their daily lives with hope for tomorrow, trusting that human wisdom would find a way through any crisis. The Great War itself, terrible as it was, lasted only a few hours, a brief moment of madness in the long story of human civilization. But in those quiet moments before the bombs fell, there was still hope. In the emergency shelters, families held each other close. In the command bunkers, some leaders hesitated before giving the final orders. In laboratories around the world, scientists worked frantically on projects that might have prevented the catastrophe if time had allowed. Even in the aftermath, as we've seen, humanity's capacity for adaptation and cooperation emerged from the ruins. The survivors who gathered in places like Megaton and Rivet City demonstrated that the human spirit cannot be broken by even the greatest disasters. They built new communities, preserved knowledge, and created art and music that found beauty even in the wasteland. They proved that as long as humans draw breath, there is hope for renewal and recovery. Picture the Vault-Tec shelters not as prisons but as arcs, preserving human life through the storm of radiation until the world could heal. Imagine the Brotherhood of Steel not as hoarding tyrants but as librarians of humanity, carefully tending the flame of knowledge through the long night of ignorance. See the communities of the wasteland not as desperate survivors but as pioneers of a new world, learning to live in harmony with their changed environment. Think of the children born after the Great War, those who knew no other world than the wasteland. They adapted with remarkable resilience, learning to find wonder in the glow of Nuka-Cola Quantum, friendship in the loyalty of dog-meat companions, and adventure in the exploration of vault ruins. Their innocence and adaptability remind us that humans can make a home anywhere, can find joy in any circumstances, can build hope from the smallest seeds. The radiation that seems so terrifying becomes, in some ways, simply another weather pattern to be understood and navigated. The mutated creatures that roam the wasteland find their own ecological niches, creating new forms of beauty and balance. The ruins of the old world become monuments to what was, while also providing the building blocks for what might yet be. Nothing is ever truly lost. It only changes form. Consider how the pre-war world's obsession with consumption and accumulation gave way to simpler values of community, craftsmanship, and making do with what you have. The settlers who built wooden walls from scavenged materials, who learned to purify water with improvised filters, who created art from bottle caps and circuit boards. They discovered that human creativity flourishes under any conditions. Scarcity bred innovation, hardship fostered cooperation, and loss deepened appreciation for what remained. The trading caravans that brave the dangers of the wasteland to connect isolated communities carry more than goods. They carry stories, news, and the essential human connections that prevent isolation from becoming despair. The Brahmin that pull their carts may have two heads now, but they serve the same eternal function as the beasts of burden that carried human civilization from its earliest days. The roads may be cracked and dangerous, but they still lead to new horizons. Even the factions that emerged from the ashes, the NCR with its democratic ideals, the Brotherhood with its dedication to knowledge, Caesar's Legion with its harsh order, each represents a different vision of how humanity might organize itself for survival and growth. Their conflicts, while sometimes violent, also demonstrate the continued vitality of human political thought and the refusal to accept that there is only one way to build a society. The Pip-Boys worn by vault dwellers become symbols of optimism, their cheerful, retro-futuristic design, a reminder that even in the darkest times, humans can maintain their sense of humor and hope. The radio stations that broadcast across the wasteland play music that lifts spirits and connects listeners to a shared cultural heritage. The bobbleheads and lunchboxes that survivors collect show the human need for small pleasures and personal meaning, even in the midst of grand struggles. Think of the sunset over the capital wasteland, painting the ruins of Washington, D.C. in gentle golden light. The Lincoln Memorial, though damaged, still stands as a testament to human dignity and the possibility of better angels triumphing over baser instincts. The Washington Monument, cracked but unbroken, points skyward as it always did, a reminder that human aspirations reach beyond immediate circumstances toward eternal ideals. The water, when it finally flows clean again from Project Purity, brings not just physical sustenance, but symbolic renewal. Proof that dedication and sacrifice can indeed restore what was poisoned and broken. The children who drink that clean water will grow up in a world where such restoration is possible, where the sins of the past need not condemn the hopes of the future. In the quiet of the night, when the wasteland settles into peaceful darkness, the stars shine as brightly as they ever did. The same constellations that guided ancient mariners and inspired philosophers still wheel overhead, unchanged by earthly catastrophes. They remind us that human problems, however vast they seem, occur within a larger context of beauty and meaning that endures beyond any single civilization's rise or fall. The Great War, for all its horror, becomes in the end a chapter in the longer story of human resilience and renewal. It was not the end of human history, but a comma in the long sentence of human experience. The survivors who emerged from their shelters to rebuild carried within themselves all the accumulated wisdom, creativity, and love that makes humanity precious. They were not diminished beings, but inheritors of everything valuable that came before. Rest now in the knowledge that even in humanity's darkest hour, the qualities that make us human, curiosity, compassion, creativity, and courage, survived and flourished. The Great War could destroy cities and technologies, but it could not destroy the human spirit. In every settlement that arose from the ruins, in every child born in the wasteland, in every act of kindness between strangers, the best of humanity reasserted itself. Sleep peacefully, knowing that the story of the Great War is ultimately a story of hope. It shows us that no catastrophe, however complete it seems, can eliminate the possibility of renewal. It reminds us that humans are remarkably adaptable, that love persists under the most difficult conditions, and that the future, however different it may be from what we expected, can still hold wonder and joy. Dream of the world that was, with gratitude for its achievements and understanding of its failures. Dream of the world that came after, with admiration for its courage and ingenuity. Dream of worlds yet to come, built on the foundation of hard-won wisdom, about both the possibilities and the responsibilities that come with great power. The Great War's timeline ends, but the human story continues. In your dreams tonight, may you walk the peaceful paths that connect what was lost to what might yet be found, what was broken to what can still be healed, what was feared to what can still be hoped. Rest well, wanderer. The Great War is over. The long peace of sleep begins. And so, dear wanderer, our chronicle of the Great War draws to its quiet conclusion. We have walked together through the decades of mounting tension, witnessed the final desperate hours of human civilization, and seen how humanity found ways to survive and adapt, even in the face of ultimate catastrophe. We have traced the arc from the golden optimism of the atomic age to the harsh realities of the wasteland, discovering that even in destruction, there are seeds of renewal. This tale of humanity's greatest failure is also, paradoxically, a testament to its greatest strength, the capacity to endure, to adapt, and to find hope in the darkest circumstances. The Great War destroyed a world, but it could not destroy the human spirit. In every survivor who emerged from the ruins, in every community that formed from the ashes, in every child born into the new world, humanity reasserted its claim to a future worth fighting for. The 2 hours and 7 minutes of nuclear exchange that ended one world and began another remind us of both the awesome power of human technology and the awesome responsibility that comes with wielding such power. The Great War stands as both warning and inspiration. A warning of what can happen when wisdom fails to match capability, an inspiration for the resilience that allows life to continue even after the greatest disasters. Perhaps in your dreams tonight, you will visit those pre-war diners with their robot waitresses and atomic age optimism. Perhaps you will walk through the wasteland settlements where survivors built new lives from the debris of the old. Perhaps you will see the lights of New Vegas glowing in the desert, or hear the radio playing old songs across the capital wasteland, or watch the sunrise paint the ruins of Boston in golden light. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time and across the wasteland. May the knowledge we have shared bring you interesting dreams and peaceful sleep. May the courage of the survivors inspire you to face tomorrow's challenges with hope and determination. And may you wake refreshed, carrying with you the understanding that no matter how dark the night may seem, dawn always comes again. Rest well, wanderer. Rest well and dream of the world that was, the world that is, and the world that yet might be. The Great War is ended. The story continues. Sleep peacefully now, knowing that in the end, hope endures. Good night.